When someone says alien, what's the first image that comes to mind? For millions of people, it's the little green men, small, mysterious beings with oversized heads and strange powers. But have you ever wondered where this famous alien image actually came from? Were the little green men created by Hollywood, inspired by real UFO encounters, or based on stories that go back much further than most people realize? In this video, we uncover the origins, alleged agenda, and hidden mysteries behind the world's most iconic alien race, and explore why the legend of the little green men refuses to disappear. Somewhere in the collective imagination of the 20th century, a figure took shape that no government report, no scientific journal, and no religious text had ever formally described, and yet almost everyone alive today could sketch it from memory. A small body, no taller than a child, skin the color of moss or algae, a head too large for its frame, and eyes that seem to hold something ancient behind them. We call this figure the Little Green Man, and for nearly 100 years it has stood at the center of one of the strangest and most persistent mysteries in modern history. Not because scientists have confirmed its existence, but because millions of ordinary people across every continent, in every decade since the 1940s, have insisted they saw it with their own eyes. The phrase itself is older than the modern flying saucer era, and its origins are messier than most people assume. It did not begin in a government file or a scientific paper. It began, like so many enduring myths, as a kind of shorthand, a phrase newspapers reached for when they needed to describe something for which no vocabulary yet existed. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Little Green Men was already circulating in American slang as a jokey stand-in for anything strange, foreign, or hard to explain, often applied sarcastically to drunks seeing things that were not there. It carried a tone of dismissal. To claim you had seen little green men was, for decades, understood as a polite way of saying you were not to be believed. That changed almost overnight in the middle of the 20th century, when the phrase collided with a new kind of anxiety. The Second World War had just ended. The atomic bomb had rewritten what human beings believed was possible, for better and for a great deal worse. Radar technology, developed in secrecy during the war, was suddenly scanning the skies in ways it never had before, and pilots, radar operators, and ordinary citizens began reporting objects that moved in patterns no known aircraft could achieve. Sudden stops, right-angle turns, speeds that defied the aerodynamics of the era. In June of 1947, a businessman and private pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 crescent-shaped objects flying in formation near Mount Rainier in Washington state, moving, in his words, like saucers skipped across water. Within days, newspapers across the country had coined the term flying saucer, and a cultural fuse had been lit that has never fully gone out. What followed was not a single event, but a cascade. Reports of unidentified aerial phenomena spiked across the United States within weeks of Arnold's sighting, then spread internationally. The United States Army Air Forces, and later the newly formed Air Force, found themselves fielding an avalanche of testimony from pilots, police officers, and civilians, all describing metallic, disc-shaped, or cigar-shaped craft performing maneuvers that seemed to mock the laws of physics as they were then understood. And almost immediately, a second question rode alongside the first. If these objects were real, and if they were not of human origin, then who, or what, was flying them? This is the point where the little green man stops being a dismissive slang term and becomes something closer to a cultural prophecy. Pulp science fiction magazines of the 1920s through 1940s had already primed the public imagination with visions of Martians, moonmen, and creatures from other worlds, many of them small, humanoid, and unsettlingly plant-colored. A visual shorthand borrowed loosely from the presumed vegetation-based ecology of other planets. When real people began reporting encounters with actual beings, not just objects in the sky, but figures who emerged from landed craft and, in a handful of celebrated cases, were seen up close. The language of pulp fiction was ready and waiting to describe them. The little green man was, in this sense, a myth that existed in the culture before it existed in anyone's actual testimony, which is part of why skeptics have long argued that witnesses were unconsciously reaching for an image implanted by decades of magazine covers and radio dramas, rather than describing something genuinely novel. But the believers and the witnesses who insisted their encounters were real and not imagined tell a different story, and it is worth taking that story seriously enough to examine it in detail, which is precisely what this documentary intends to do across the parts that follow. Because whatever the ultimate explanation, extraterrestrial visitors, misidentified aircraft, psychological phenomena, folklore updated for the atomic age, or something we do not yet have a framework to describe, the little green man narrative did not stay confined to a handful of eccentric witnesses. It became one of the most globally recognized figures in human storytelling, rivaling ghosts, angels, and demons in its reach. And unlike those older figures, it emerged and spread within a documented, traceable historical window, giving researchers something ghosts and angels never offered, a beginning they could actually study. To understand where this figure came from, we have to resist the temptation to start the story in 1947, because the deeper roots of the little green man reach back much further into folklore traditions that predate flying saucers by centuries. Long before anyone spoke of extraterrestrials, communities across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Africa told stories of small, humanoid beings who lived apart from human society, who were sometimes glimpsed but rarely caught, who abducted people and returned them changed, and who possessed knowledge or technology beyond ordinary human understanding. The fairy folk of the British Isles, the elemental spirits of continental European tradition, the little people of numerous indigenous American cultures, and comparable figures from folklore traditions around the world share a startling number of structural similarities with modern alien abduction testimony. Missing time, altered memory, physical marks left on the body, and a profound sense that the encounter was simultaneously deeply real and somehow outside ordinary reality. Some researchers, most notably the psychiatrist and UFO investigator Jacques Vallée, have argued that we are not looking at two separate phenomena, one ancient and one modern, but at a single, continuous human experience that each era interprets through the technological and cultural vocabulary available to it. Where a medieval peasant saw a fairy mound and a changeling child, a mid-century American saw a flying saucer and a small green humanoid. The costume changed. The underlying experience, Vallée and others suggest, may not have. This is not a fringe position quietly whispered at the edges of ufology. It represents one of the two great interpretive camps that have divided researchers of the phenomenon since the 1950s. And understanding this division is essential before we go any further, because almost everything in this documentary touches it in some way. The first camp, often called the extraterrestrial hypothesis, holds that at least some portion of UFO sightings and alien encounter reports represent genuine visitations by beings from other planets, or possibly other star systems, physically traveling to Earth using technology far in advance of our own. The second camp encompasses a range of alternative explanations: psychological, sociological, and even what some researchers call interdimensional or psychosocial hypotheses that treat the phenomenon as real in its effects on witnesses and culture, but not necessarily literal in the sense of small green beings physically stepping out of metal spacecraft. Skeptics occupy a related but distinct third position, arguing that the vast majority, and possibly the entirety, of sightings and encounters can be explained through misidentification of conventional aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, hoaxes, and well-documented quirks of human perception and memory under stress. What makes the little green man such a useful lens for exploring this entire debate is that it sits at the intersection of all three positions. It is concrete enough to be described, drawn, and merchandised, yet elusive enough that no verified physical specimen has ever been produced. It appears in testimony from witnesses who have passed polygraph examinations, and it appears in testimony that later unraveled under scrutiny. It has been treated as a serious subject of study by scientists, military personnel, and government agencies, and it has simultaneously become one of the most recognizable jokes in popular culture, printed on children's lunchboxes, animated in cartoons, and stitched into Halloween costumes. Few figures in modern folklore carry that particular combination of gravity and absurdity at the same time, and that tension is exactly what this documentary sets out to unpack. Over the course of this series, we are going to trace the little green man from its earliest folkloric ancestors through its explosive emergence in the post-war UFO era, through the pivotal cases that shaped how the public came to imagine alien visitors, and into the more unsettling territory of alleged government cover-ups, classified programs, and claims of a deliberate, decades-long campaign to manage what the public is allowed to know. We will examine the contactee movement of the 1950s, in which ordinary people claimed not just to have seen alien beings, but to have spoken with them, traveled with them, and received messages from them intended for all of humanity. We will look closely at the transformation sometime in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s and 1980s. From the squat, green, almost comical figure of early sightings into the taller, grayer, more clinical being that dominates abduction testimony from the 1980s onward. A shift so significant that some researchers treat it as evidence of a changing cultural template, while others argue it reflects an actual evolution or diversification in the beings being encountered. We will spend considerable time on the psychological and neurological research that has attempted to explain abduction experiences without invoking extraterrestrials at all, including sleep paralysis, temporal lobe activity, and the well-documented unreliability of memory recovered under hypnosis, a technique that was used extensively by early abduction researchers and that modern memory scientists now regard with significant caution. We will examine the most serious and most disputed claims about an official government interest in this phenomenon, including declassified documents, whistleblower testimony, and the persistent rumors of a secretive group sometimes referred to as Majestic 12, allegedly formed to manage recovered alien technology and, in some versions of the story, recovered alien bodies. And we will bring the story into the present day, to the remarkable and largely unprecedented series of official acknowledgments made by the United States government beginning in 2017, when previously classified military footage of unidentified aerial phenomena was confirmed as authentic by the Department of Defense, followed by congressional hearings, an official reporting mechanism, and testimony from former intelligence officials making claims that would have been dismissed as science fiction a generation earlier. Before any of that, though, we need to sit with a simpler question, because it is the question that makes everything else in this story possible. Why humanoid? Why small? Why green? If extraterrestrial life exists, and if it has evolved on a planet with a different atmosphere, different gravity, different chemistry, and billions of years of independent evolutionary pressure, there is no obvious reason it should resemble a small human being at all, let alone one with the specific coloring and proportions that show up again and again in witness testimony across unrelated cases, unrelated decades, and unrelated cultures. Some biologists have argued that convergent evolution could plausibly produce humanoid body plans under certain conditions. Bilateral symmetry, an upright posture, and manipulative limbs are all advantageous traits that could emerge independently on other worlds, much as eyes and wings have evolved multiple times independently here on Earth. Other scientists find this explanation strained and argue instead that the humanoid shape of our alien visitors tells us less about biology on other planets and more about the limits of human imagination. That we are, in the end, incapable of picturing something genuinely alien and default instead to the one template every human brain is wired from birth to recognize instantly: the human face, the human form, distorted just enough to feel foreign, but never so much that it stops registering as a person. That question of green skin has its own peculiar history, one that reveals just how much the collective image of the little green man was shaped not by physical evidence, but by decades of storytelling that occurred well before the modern UFO era began. The astronomer Percival Lowell's widely publicized and ultimately mistaken claims in the late 19th and early 20th centuries about artificial canals on Mars fueled a public fascination with the idea of an ancient, dying Martian civilization, and early science fiction writers ran with the idea, imagining Martians as advanced but alien, often rendered in illustrations with a greenish cast meant to evoke both their otherworldliness and a loose, unscientific association with plant-based biology suited to a planet imagined to be resource-poor and vegetation-dependent. By the time real witnesses began describing actual encounters in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, the color green was already deeply embedded in the public's mental image of what a Martian, or any alien, was supposed to look like. Whether or not any actual extraterrestrial being had ever been green at all. It is worth pausing here to note an important and often overlooked detail. Despite the overwhelming cultural association between the phrase little green men and modern ufology, the color green is actually reported far less often in serious witness testimony than popular culture would suggest. The overwhelming majority of humanoid encounter reports collected by ufologists since the 1950s describe beings with gray, white, tan, or brown skin tones, not green. The most famous and most thoroughly documented humanoid encounter of the entire early UFO era, the Kelly Hopkinsville incident of 1955, which we will examine in close detail in the next part of this series, does describe creatures often remembered in popular retellings as green, though the original witness testimony is considerably more ambiguous and complicated than the popular legend suggests. In other words, the little green man as a specific, consistently described figure may be less a product of accumulated eyewitness testimony and more a product of cultural consensus, a kind of composite myth assembled gradually out of pulp fiction imagery, a handful of ambiguous early reports, and decades of cartoons, films, and merchandising that simplified a genuinely diverse and often contradictory body of testimony into a single, marketable, and endlessly reproducible image. That gap between the messy historical record and the clean cultural icon is, in many ways, the central mystery this documentary is built around. It is not simply the question of whether alien beings have visited Earth, though that question runs beneath everything we will discuss. It is the deeper and, in some ways, more answerable question of how a myth is built, how a phrase used sarcastically in 19th century American slang, combined with pulp science fiction imagery, combined with a handful of genuinely strange and still unexplained encounters in the mid-20th century, combined with government secrecy, Cold War paranoia, and the commercial machinery of American popular culture, fused together into one of the most recognizable and enduring figures in modern storytelling. Understanding that process does not require us to resolve, once and for all, whether extraterrestrial beings are real. It requires us to look honestly at the evidence, the testimony, the documented history, and the psychology of belief, and to let the story lead us wherever it actually goes. It is also worth understanding, before we go any further, just how quickly this phenomenon moved from fringe curiosity to a matter of official concern. Within months of Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting, the United States Army Air Forces had launched what would become a series of formal investigations into unidentified flying objects, beginning with a short-lived effort known as Project Sign, which produced an internal estimate suggesting that at least some sightings might represent genuine unknown craft, a conclusion reportedly rejected and suppressed by senior Air Force leadership, uncomfortable with its implications. Project Sign was succeeded by Project Grudge, a considerably more skeptical effort explicitly oriented toward explaining away sightings rather than investigating them on their own terms, and Grudge was in turn succeeded in 1952 by the program most people today associate with official UFO investigation, Project Blue Book. Over the 17 years of its operation, Blue Book collected more than 12,000 reported sightings, and by the time it was formally closed in December of 1969, the Air Force's official position was that the overwhelming majority of cases could be attributed to misidentified aircraft, astronomical objects, weather phenomena, and a small number of hoaxes. With a residual category of several hundred cases, the investigators openly acknowledged they could not explain. The scientific consultant most closely associated with Project Blue Book, the astronomer J. Allen Hynek, occupies a particularly important place in this story because his own trajectory mirrors the arc of the entire phenomenon. Hynek began his involvement as a committed skeptic, brought on specifically to apply rigorous scientific method to what the Air Force largely regarded as a public relations problem rather than a genuine scientific question. Over nearly 2 decades of reviewing case files, interviewing witnesses, and watching the Air Force dismiss reports he felt deserved serious investigation, Hynek's position shifted dramatically. By the time Blue Book closed, he had become one of the most credible and vocal advocates for treating unexplained aerial phenomena as a legitimate subject of scientific inquiry, going on to found the Center for UFO Studies and to develop the classification system, including the now famous term close encounter, that continues to structure how researchers categorize sightings and contact claims today. Hynek's transformation from institutional skeptic to serious researcher is frequently cited by those who take the phenomenon seriously as evidence that dismissiveness is not the same as rigor, and it is cited just as frequently by skeptics as evidence of how personal investment and years of immersion in ambiguous data can gradually erode scientific caution. Both readings tell us something true about how belief, credibility, and evidence interact in this field, and we will return to that tension repeatedly throughout this series. The scale of public belief in this phenomenon is itself remarkable and worth stating plainly before we move forward. Public opinion surveys conducted across the decades since the 1960s have consistently found that a substantial share of the American public, frequently in the range of 1/3 to 1/2 of respondents, depending on the specific question asked and the year surveyed, believes that UFOs represent something genuinely unexplained by conventional means, and a smaller, but still significant portion believes specifically that intelligent extraterrestrial life has visited Earth. These are not fringe numbers confined to a small subculture of enthusiasts. They represent, by any reasonable standard, one of the most widely held beliefs in unexplained phenomena in the modern world, on par with or exceeding public belief in ghosts, psychic ability, or other paranormal claims, and yet the subject has historically received a fraction of the sustained, well-funded scientific attention given to far less widely believed phenomena. That imbalance between the scale of public interest and the scale of serious scientific investment is itself part of the mystery this documentary is interested in, because it raises an uncomfortable question that has dogged the field for generations. Is the imbalance a rational response to a lack of credible evidence, or is it evidence of a genuine cultural taboo actively or passively enforced against taking the subject seriously, regardless of what the evidence might show? We raise that question here not to answer it prematurely, but to make clear the spirit in which this documentary intends to proceed. We will not ask you to believe. We will lay out, case by case, decade by decade, what witnesses said, what investigators found, what skeptics have demonstrated, and what remains genuinely, stubbornly unexplained. And we will let the accumulated weight of that record speak for itself. Some of what follows will sound like careful history. Some of it will sound like conspiracy. Both threads are part of the honest record of this phenomenon, and separating them cleanly is, as you will see, far harder than either true believers or committed skeptics tend to admit. Before the saucers, fairies, elementals, and the little people. Long before anyone spoke of flying saucers, the peoples of the British Isles were already telling stories about small humanoid beings who lived at the edges of human settlement, who could be glimpsed in twilight or moonlight, but almost never in full daylight, and who took a persistent, sometimes malevolent interest in human affairs. We know them today as the fairy folk, though that single word flattens what was across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. a genuinely vast and regionally distinct body of belief, encompassing dozens of named categories of beings with different temperaments, different powers, and different relationships to the humans, unlucky or unlucky enough to encounter them. What unites nearly all of these traditions, and what makes them so relevant to the story we are telling, is a recurring structure of encounter that shows up with startling consistency from region to region, century to century, and that bears an equally startling resemblance to testimony collected from self-described alien abductees more than 200 years later. Consider the phenomenon folklorists call fairy abduction. Across an enormous body of recorded testimony, much of it collected by 19th and early 20th century folklorists who took great care to preserve the exact words of rural informants, a consistent pattern emerges. A person, often alone, often near a specific liminal location, such as a fairy ring, a hollow hill, or a crossroads at dusk, encounters small beings who lead them away, sometimes through what witnesses describe as an opening in the earth or a passage that should not exist. Time inside this other place behaves strangely. What feels to the abductee like a single evening of dancing or feasting turns out, upon their return, to have consumed days, months, or in the most extreme accounts, years of ordinary time. The returned person frequently struggles to describe exactly what happened, reporting fragmented, dreamlike memories rather than a clear linear account, and often describes a lingering sense of having been changed by the experience in ways they cannot fully articulate. In a smaller but well-documented subset of cases, the abductee returns with physical marks, unexplained by any conventional cause that they attribute directly to their time among the fairy folk. If that description sounds familiar, it should. Missing time, fragmented and dreamlike recall, a sense of profound personal transformation, and unexplained physical marks are, almost word for word, the core features that define the modern alien abduction narrative as it was codified by researchers in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. This parallel did not go unnoticed by serious researchers. The French-American astronomer and computer scientist Jacques Vallée, who worked alongside J. Allen Hynek and became one of the most intellectually serious investigators the field has ever produced, argued at length, most notably in his 1969 book, Passport to Magonia, that the structural similarity between fairy lore and UFO abduction testimony was too precise and too consistent to be coincidental. Vallée's proposal was not that fairies were literally the same beings as modern alien visitors wearing a different cultural costume. His argument was subtler and, in some ways, more unsettling. That human beings across history appear to undergo a genuinely consistent category of anomalous experience, one that predates any specific cultural explanation for it, and that each era's witnesses reach for whatever explanatory framework their culture has made available to them. A 17th century Scottish farmer had fairies and the folk of the Hollow Hills available as an explanatory framework. A 20th century American, raised on pulp science fiction and post-war space anxiety, had little green men and flying saucers instead. The experience, Vallée suggested, might be the constant. The explanation is the variable. This argument extends comfortably beyond the British Isles. Continental European folklore is dense with structurally similar figures, the kobolds and dwarves of German tradition, the domovoi of Slavic households, the various nature spirits and elementals cataloged across Scandinavian, Baltic, and Alpine folk traditions, many of them described as small, often associated with underground dwellings, and frequently credited with knowledge, craft, or technology beyond ordinary human capability. The theme of beings who possess superior skill, particularly in metalwork and craftsmanship, recurs so often across unrelated European folk traditions that some folklorists have proposed it reflects a genuinely ancient, shared substrate of belief about hidden, technologically sophisticated others living alongside or beneath ordinary human society, a substrate old enough and widespread enough to predate any single cultural or linguistic group. The pattern is not confined to Europe. A great many indigenous nations across North America maintain traditions concerning small, humanoid beings who inhabit forests, mountains, and other liminal landscapes, traditions that in most cases long predate any contact with European colonizers and their folklore. The Cherokee tradition of the Unwi, often translated as the little people, describes small beings who could help or harm depending on how they were treated, who were credited with teaching humans certain skills, and who were understood to prefer that humans not speak of encountering them on pain of misfortune. Comparable figures appear, under different names and with locally distinct characteristics, in the oral traditions of numerous other indigenous nations across the continent. It is important to state clearly that these traditions are living, sacred belief systems belonging to specific communities, not folklore curiosities to be flattened into evidence for a UFO theory, and this documentary does not intend to treat them that way. What we can observe, respectfully, and at the level of comparative folklore study, is that the broad structural theme, small humanoid beings, often hidden, often possessing power or knowledge beyond ordinary human reach, encountered at the edges of settled land, recurs across an extraordinary range of cultures that had no contact with one another, which is precisely the kind of pattern that invites the question Valet and others have asked: is this a coincidence of human storytelling, or a description of something genuinely, persistently encountered by human beings across history, regardless of the vocabulary available to describe it? Skeptics offer a more conservative explanation, and it deserves to be stated with equal weight. Human beings, this argument holds, are pattern-seeking creatures with a small number of recurring cognitive and physiological experiences: sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucination, the effects of isolation, fatigue, or altered states of consciousness, and a deep-seated evolutionary wariness of the dark and of the edges of known territory. Confronted with these experiences, and lacking a scientific vocabulary to explain them, human cultures across history and geography independently generated broadly similar folk explanations, not because they were describing the same external phenomenon, but because they were describing the same internal human experience filtered through the universal architecture of the human brain. Sleep paralysis, in particular, has drawn enormous attention from researchers studying both fairy lore and alien abduction claims, because it produces, with remarkable reliability, precisely the sensations reported in both traditions: an inability to move, a sense of a malevolent or purposeful presence in the room, and in a significant number of cases, visual or quasi-visual hallucinations of small humanoid figures standing at the foot of the bed. We will examine the neuroscience of sleep paralysis and its relationship to abduction testimony in much greater detail later in this series, because it represents one of the single most important pieces of the puzzle for anyone trying to separate genuine anomaly from explainable human experience. Whichever explanation one favors, the folklore record matters enormously to the story of the Little Green Man, because it establishes something the post-war UFO era did not invent from nothing: the template of the small, humanoid, otherworldly being who interacts with humans in strange, often frightening, sometimes transformative ways, was already deeply embedded in human storytelling long before Kenneth Arnold ever saw 9 objects skip across the sky above Mount Rainier. When American witnesses in the late 1940s and through the 1950s began describing encounters with strange beings connected to unidentified aerial craft, they were not working from a blank cultural slate. They were, whether consciously or not, drawing on a reservoir of folk imagery, structure, and expectation that had been accumulating in human culture for centuries, now given a new setting: outer space instead of the hollow hill, a metal craft instead of a fairy mound, but carrying forward the same essential shape. That transition from fairy folklore to space-age testimony did not happen instantly, and it is worth noting one important intermediate chapter that is often skipped over in popular retellings of UFO history. In 1896 and 1897, decades before Kenneth Arnold's sighting, the United States experienced what researchers now call the Great Airship Wave, a period of widespread newspaper reports describing cigar-shaped, often lit, often propeller-driven craft moving across the night skies of the American Midwest and beyond, frequently accompanied by claims of encounters with the craft's occupants, described in period accounts as human or near-human inventors rather than extraterrestrials, reflecting the technological optimism and anxiety of the era rather than the space-age framework that would dominate later. The airship wave is historically significant because it demonstrates that the underlying pattern of mass sighting events, localized clusters of testimony, and rapid, self-reinforcing media coverage predates not just flying saucers, but powered flight itself, since the Wright brothers would not achieve their first flight for another 7 years after the airship reports peaked. Whatever was happening in the skies or in the minds of 19th century Americans, it established a template of mass unexplained aerial phenomena that the 20th century would repeat with variations again and again. Which brings us finally to the case that did more than any other single event to fuse the folkloric template of the small, strange visitor with the emerging space-age vocabulary of flying saucers and interplanetary travel, and to plant the image of a genuinely alien, physically encountered being firmly in the American public imagination. On the night of August the 21st, 1955, in a rural area near the unincorporated community of Kelly in Christian County, Kentucky, a large extended family gathered at the farmhouse of Glennie Langford reported an encounter unlike almost anything documented before it. An encounter that would come to be known, depending on the source, as the Kelly Hopkinsville incident, the Hopkinsville Goblins case, or simply the Kelly incident. And that remains, 7 decades later, one of the most thoroughly documented and least satisfactorily explained humanoid encounter cases in American history. The evening began, according to the accounts later given separately by multiple family members to investigators, when 2 of the men living at the farm, Billy Ray Taylor and Elmer Lucky Sutton, went outside to draw water from the well and reported seeing a brightly lit object descend into a nearby gully. The claim was met, understandably, with skepticism by the rest of the household, and the matter was set aside until later that night, when the family's dogs began barking with unusual intensity, and the household reported seeing a small, strange figure approaching the house. Witnesses described the being, and in later interviews, the various family members' descriptions showed some variation, as small, roughly 3 to 4 feet in height, with an oversized head, large glowing or luminous eyes, long arms ending in clawed hands, and a metallic or silvery appearance to its skin, a detail worth noting given how firmly popular memory has since recast the creatures as green. The contemporaneous accounts, in fact, more often describe a silver or gray metallic quality to the skin, with the green association entering popular retelling later, likely reinforced by the broader cultural expectation, already well established by 1955, that alien visitors ought to be green. What followed was, by the family's account, several hours of escalating terror. The men of the household, several of them military veterans with documented combat experience and no history of panic under pressure, reportedly opened fire on the figures with shotguns and a .22 rifle on multiple occasions over the course of the night, at close range, with witnesses describing the impacts producing a metallic sound, and the figures reacting not by falling or bleeding, but by flipping backward and then, in several accounts, simply getting back up and retreating, apparently unharmed, into the surrounding trees or onto the roof of the house. The family reported that the creatures continued to appear at windows and around the property for several hours, in a siege-like pattern of the beings withdrawing after gunfire, and then reappearing shortly afterward until close to midnight, when the exhausted and thoroughly terrified household finally fled by car to the Hopkinsville police station to report the encounter. The response from local and state law enforcement is one of the details that gives this case unusual weight among UFO researchers because, unlike the great majority of encounter claims, the Kelly incident produced an immediate, same-night, multi-agency law enforcement response. Officers from the Hopkinsville City Police, the Kentucky State Police, and military police from the nearby Fort Campbell Army Base all responded to the farmhouse that same night, and the investigating officers, several of whom later gave on-record statements, described the household as being in a state of what one officer called sheer, unmistakable terror, a detail investigators have long treated as significant, since it argues against a simple hoax perpetrated for attention or profit, particularly given that the family, upon realizing how much media and public attention their account was generating, appeared to actively avoid rather than seek out further publicity in the years that followed. The responding officers reportedly found physical evidence consistent with gunfire, including spent shell casings and bullet damage to the house, but found no bodies, no blood, and no other direct physical evidence of the alleged creatures, and after searching the property without incident, departed, only for the family to report that the beings returned once the police had left, resuming their activity into the early hours of the morning. In the decades since, the Kelly Hopkinsville case has been picked apart by researchers on both sides of the debate with more sustained rigor than almost any other single humanoid encounter in American UFO history. Skeptical investigators have proposed that the family may have encountered and misidentified a group of great horned owls, a species known to inhabit the region, whose glowing eyes, pale coloring under moonlight, and aggressive territorial behavior toward perceived threats near a nest could plausibly account for at least some elements of the sighting, particularly when experienced by a frightened household in darkness over several hours. This explanation has real merit and is taken seriously even by many researchers who otherwise consider the broader UFO phenomenon worthy of study, though critics of the owl explanation point out that it struggles to account for several of the case's most distinctive details, including the consistent multi-witness description of humanoid, bipedal, clawed figures rather than birds, the reported metallic sound of gunfire striking the creatures, and the sheer duration and apparent coordination of the encounter across multiple family members over several hours. No fully satisfying account, whether mundane or extraordinary, has ever managed to explain every detail reported that night, and the case remains, in the assessment of even cautious researchers, one of the strongest examples of a mass witness humanoid encounter in the historical record. What matters most for the purposes of this documentary is not whether the Kelly Hopkinsville case represents an actual extraterrestrial encounter, an elaborate misidentification, or something else entirely, but the role it played in shaping the public template of the alien visitor going forward. Coming just 8 years after Kenneth Arnold's sighting launched the flying saucer era and receiving significant national newspaper coverage at the time, the Kelly case fused. For millions of Americans following the story in 1955, the abstract idea of a flying saucer with a concrete, terrifying image of a small, strange, humanoid being, physically present, physically interactive, and by the family's account, apparently resistant to conventional weapons. It gave the emerging myth a body, and in the years that followed, as the story was retold, simplified, and gradually absorbed into popular culture, that silvery, metallic-skinned figure from a Kentucky farmhouse would be recast again and again in the popular imagination as green, completing, whether accurately or not, the fusion of pulp-era Martian imagery with a real, documented, multiply-witnessed encounter, and giving the American public, for the first time, a face to put on the phrase, "little green men." It is worth noting, too, that this pattern is not limited to European and North American traditions, which is part of why comparative folklorists find it so compelling. Japanese folklore includes accounts of small, mischievous, humanoid beings, such as the kappa and various classes of yokai, some associated with water, some with mountains, many credited with abilities and knowledge beyond ordinary human capacity, and encountered under broadly similar liminal circumstances. Twilight, isolated water, the edges of settlement. Southern African oral traditions include accounts of small, cave-dwelling, or subterranean beings in various regional folk systems, again, often credited with superior craft or hidden knowledge. None of these traditions are identical to one another, and flattening their real cultural and theological distinctions in service of a tidy unified theory would do a disservice to the communities who hold them. But taken together as a body of comparative evidence, they support the observation researchers like Vallée were making. That something about the small, hidden, technologically or magically superior humanoid figure recurs across human cultures with a frequency that is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence, regardless of which explanatory framework, supernatural, psychological, or extraterrestrial, one ultimately favors for it. The Space Brothers, contact, not conflict. If the story of the little green man had ended with fearful defensive encounters like the siege at Kelly Hopkinsville, the myth that emerged from the 1950s might have remained a story about monsters. Instead, almost simultaneously, a second and in many ways stranger movement was taking shape in the same decade, one built not on fear but on invitation. Its adherents did not claim to have been attacked by strange beings emerging from a landed craft in the dark. They claimed to have been welcomed aboard those craft, to have spoken at length with their occupants, and in several of the most famous cases, to have been given messages of profound spiritual and political significance intended for the whole of humanity. History remembers this movement and the people at its center by a single word: contactees. And understanding the contactee movement is essential to understanding the full, tangled shape of the little green man mythology, because it introduced, alongside the small and often frightening figures of encounter cases like Kelly, an entirely different kind of visitor, one that was almost never described as small, almost never described as green, and almost never described as anything other than remarkably, even suspiciously, human. The contactee era effectively begins with a single man and a single afternoon in the California desert. On November the 20th, 1952, a Polish-born amateur astronomer and philosopher named George Adamski claimed that he and several companions traveled into the desert near Desert Center, California, where Adamski separated from the group and, by his account, encountered a landed flying saucer and its pilot, a being he described as human in every visible respect. Tall, slender, with long blonde hair, tanned skin, and features Adamski characterized as strikingly beautiful, dressed in a close-fitting one-piece garment. Adamski claimed the being communicated with him through a combination of telepathy and gestures, identified himself by the name Orthon, and explained that he came from the planet Venus, part of a broader confederation of benevolent beings from across the solar system who were concerned about humanity's development of nuclear weapons and the threat this posed not only to Earth but to the wider solar community. Adamski's account, along with a series of photographs he claimed depicted the Venusian scout craft and later a larger mothership, was published in the 1953 book Flying Saucers Have Landed, co-written with the British aristocrat and UFO enthusiast Desmond Leslie, and the book became an international sensation, catapulting Adamski from an obscure hamburger stand operator and amateur telescope owner into arguably the most famous UFO contactee in history, a status he retained through subsequent books, lecture tours, and even a claimed audience with Queen Juliana of the Netherlands and Pope John XXIII, until his death in 1965. Adamski's claims did not go unchallenged, and the challenges arrived quickly and from multiple directions. Photographic analysts noted a striking resemblance between Adamski's images of the Venusian scout ship and a chicken brooder lamp of a type commonly available at the time, complete with what appeared to be identical structural details, and other researchers pointed to inconsistencies between different accounts Adamski gave of the same encounter over the years. Even researchers broadly sympathetic to the possibility of genuine extraterrestrial contact, including some of Adamski's former associates and collaborators, eventually distanced themselves from his specific claims, citing what they described as fabrications, inconsistencies, and a pattern of escalating and increasingly implausible follow-up stories, including later claims of repeated trips aboard alien spacecraft to the far side of the moon and beyond. And yet, Adamski's influence on the shape of the emerging UFO mythology is difficult to overstate. He established, in the popular imagination and in the template later contactees would follow almost without exception, the image of the benevolent, human-appearing space brother concerned with humanity's moral and technological development, carrying warnings about nuclear weapons that resonated powerfully with a Cold War public living under the genuine and immediate threat of atomic annihilation. Adamski was quickly followed by a wave of others making structurally similar claims. Truman Bethurum, a Nevada highway maintenance worker, published an account in 1954 describing repeated meetings with a striking female commander named Aura Raines, who Bethurum claimed piloted a craft from a planet called Clarion, permanently hidden from Earth on the far side of the sun. Daniel Fry, an engineer working at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, claimed in 1950, though the account was not widely publicized until several years later, to have been taken on an unpiloted automated flight from New Mexico to New York and back in under 30 minutes aboard a craft belonging to descendants of an ancient advanced human civilization. Orfeo Angelucci, a factory worker in California, described a series of increasingly elaborate mystical encounters beginning in 1952, including telepathic communication and what he characterized as profound spiritual transformation, described at length in his 1955 book, The Secret of the Saucers. Howard Menger claimed extended contact with space brothers beginning in his childhood and continuing into adulthood, including claims of romantic involvement with a Venusian woman. And George Van Tassel, a former aviation engineer, established what became one of the most important physical gathering points for the entire movement. An annual UFO convention held at Giant Rock in the California desert beginning in 1954, drawing crowds that by some accounts reached into the thousands and inspired, Van Tassel claimed, by messages received telepathically from a being named Ashtar to construct a dome structure called the Integratron, intended to function as a rejuvenation and anti-gravity research device. Several features unite this first generation of contactees and distinguish their claims sharply from the encounter reports we examined in the previous part of this series, where witnesses at Kelly Hopkinsville described small, silvery, non-communicative, and apparently hostile or at minimum defensive beings. The contactees uniformly described their visitors as tall, human in appearance, calm, articulate, and benevolent, frequently identified by name, and frequently possessing what contactees described as an almost spiritually advanced, morally superior character. Where the Kelly Hopkinsville beings never spoke and responded to gunfire with what witnesses interpreted as alarm or aggression, the contactee visitors delivered lengthy verbal or telepathic messages, most of them organized around a remarkably consistent set of themes: concern over nuclear weapons and the possibility of humanity destroying itself or damaging the wider solar system, warnings about environmental destruction decades before environmentalism entered mainstream American politics, calls for global peace and spiritual development, and often an explicitly religious or quasi-religious framing in which the Space Brothers were positioned as guardians or elder siblings of humanity, here to guide rather than to conquer or study. This consistency across supposedly independent, unconnected contactees is itself one of the most contested aspects of the movement. Believers and sympathetic researchers have argued that the thematic consistency reflects a genuine, coordinated outreach effort by an actual extraterrestrial confederation, communicating a consistent message to multiple human contacts across different locations as part of a deliberate strategy. Skeptics, and this is by far the more widely accepted explanation among historians of the movement, point out that the contactees were not, in fact, operating in isolation from one another. Many attended the same lecture circuits, read one another's books, appeared at the same conventions, including Van Tassel's gatherings at Giant Rock, and were embedded in overlapping social and, in several documented cases, financial networks. The remarkable thematic consistency of their claimed messages looks considerably less remarkable. In this reading, once one accounts for the fact that the contactees were absorbing, consciously or not, one another's material, along with the broader cultural anxieties of a Cold War public already primed by the same themes appearing in newspapers, radio programs, and popular science fiction of the era. It is also worth noting plainly that the contactee movement produced, almost from its inception, significant financial incentive structures that skeptics argue help explain its rapid growth and thematic homogeneity. Books, paid lectures, convention appearances, and in some cases the sale of photographs, artifacts, and personal consultations became genuine sources of income and social status for successful contactees, and the movement's internal culture rewarded increasingly elaborate and specific claims with increased attention, book sales, and standing within the community. This economic dimension does not, on its own, prove that every contactee claim was fabricated for profit, and several contactees appear, by the accounts of people who knew them personally, to have sincerely believed in the reality of their experiences even as outside observers grew skeptical. But it does provide skeptics with a coherent, non-extraterrestrial explanation for why the movement grew as quickly as it did, and why its central claims converge so tightly around a small number of recurring themes. The contactee movement's most lasting and, in some respects, most surprising legacy is not found in ufology at all, but in the history of American new religious movements. Several contactee-derived groups evolved, over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, into organized religious or quasi-religious movements with lasting institutional structures, most notably the Aetherius Society, founded in 1955 by the British contactee George King, who claimed to channel messages from a being called Aetherius and other members of what he described as an interplanetary parliament, and which continues to operate today as a registered religious organization with congregations in multiple countries. This pattern, in which UFO contact claims evolve into structured religious movements complete with cosmology, ethical teaching, ritual practice, and institutional continuity across generations of believers, recurs repeatedly throughout the later history of ufology, and researchers of new religious movements have argued persuasively that the UFO contact narrative functions for a significant number of adherents in ways structurally very similar to more traditional religious revelation, a transcendent encounter with a superior, benevolent intelligence, delivering moral guidance and a promise of humanity's larger cosmic significance at a moment in the 20th century when traditional religious authority was, for many people, under genuine cultural strain. The contactee movement's insistence on tall, human-appearing, benevolent visitors also created a lasting and often overlooked tension at the heart of the broader UFO mythology, one that this documentary needs to name directly. The popular cultural shorthand of the Little Green Man and the contactee movement's Space Brother are, in the actual historical record of claimed encounters, almost entirely different figures, described by different types of witnesses in different circumstances, carrying different implications. The small, often frightening, often silvery or gray-skinned beings associated with cases like Kelly Hopkinsville and with the abduction cases we will examine in the next part of this series, exist in an uneasy and rarely reconciled relationship with the tall, blonde, human-passing space brothers of the contactee tradition, and researchers who take the phenomenon seriously have never arrived at a consensus explanation for why witness testimony should split so cleanly along these lines. Some researchers have proposed that the two traditions may represent two entirely different categories of visitor, of different origin, purpose, or even species, operating in parallel. Others argue the split reflects two different underlying human psychological or cultural processes being mistakenly grouped together under a single UFO phenomenon umbrella, when in fact, contactee claims and involuntary encounter or abduction claims may have entirely different, unrelated explanations. We will return to this tension repeatedly as the series continues because it never fully resolves, and honest treatment of this subject requires resisting the temptation to force these two very different bodies of testimony into a single tidy narrative. By the early 1960s, the classic contactee movement, with its lecture circuits, its desert conventions, and its uniformly benevolent, human-appearing space brothers, had begun to decline in cultural prominence, its most famous figures aging, several of its most prominent claims thoroughly debunked in public view, and the broader UFO conversation beginning to shift decisively toward a darker, more clinical, and far less welcoming narrative. The beings described in this next phase of the mythology would not deliver warm messages of peace through willing, flattered human intermediaries. They would arrive, according to the testimony that began to dominate the field from the early 1960s onward, uninvited, at night, on lonely roads, and the humans who claimed to encounter them would describe not conversation and spiritual uplift, but paralysis, missing time, and a growing, deeply unsettling sense of having been examined rather than greeted. The Interrupted Journey, Betty and Barney Hill, On the night of September the 19th, 1961, Betty and Barney Hill, an interracial couple from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, whose marriage was itself a quietly courageous act in an era when such unions still drew open hostility in parts of the country, were driving home from a vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal, traveling south through the White Mountains on Route 3, when Betty noticed a bright light in the sky that appeared to be following their car. What began as idle curiosity turned, over the following hour, into something closer to dread. Barney stopped the car and used binoculars to examine the object more closely, later describing seeing a structured craft with a row of windows, behind which he believed he could make out figures watching him. By his account, the sight triggered an overwhelming, almost animal panic, and he ran back to the car and drove on. Soon afterward, the couple reported hearing a strange beeping or buzzing sound, experiencing a tingling sensation, and then a second beeping sound sometime later, after which they found themselves considerably further down the road than they expected, with no clear memory of the intervening drive. When they arrived home and checked the time, they discovered that a journey they estimated should have taken a little over 4 hours had instead taken more than 7, leaving roughly 2 hours of the night entirely unaccounted for. In the weeks and months that followed, both Hills experienced escalating psychological distress. Betty began having vivid, recurring nightmares involving being taken aboard a craft and examined by strange beings, dreams detailed enough and disturbing enough that she began keeping written records of them. Barney developed a cluster of physical symptoms including ulcers, high blood pressure, and profound anxiety, along with a specific and unexplained aversion to looking at the road near the site of the sighting. Concerned for his health and struggling to understand what had happened to them, the couple eventually sought help from Dr. Benjamin Simon, a respected Boston psychiatrist and neurologist with experience using hypnosis to treat combat trauma in World War II veterans. Between January and June of 1964, Simon conducted a series of separate hypnotic regression sessions with Betty and Barney, recording each session, and it was through these sessions that the now famous narrative of the Hill abduction took its full shape. Under hypnosis, and initially without knowledge of what the other had described in their own separate sessions, both Betty and Barney recounted a broadly consistent narrative, their car being stopped on the road by a group of humanoid beings, being led aboard a landed craft, being separated from one another, and being subjected to what both described as a physical examination. Betty's account, generally considered the more detailed and internally elaborate of the two, described the beings as approximately 5 feet tall, with gray skin, large heads, and strikingly large wraparound eyes that continued around the sides of the head, along with minimal facial features otherwise, a thin mouth, no visible ears, and only slight indentations where a nose might be expected. This description, delivered under hypnosis in early 1964, stands as one of the earliest and most influential articulations of what would become, over the following 2 decades, the single most recognizable alien archetype in the world, the gray, decisively distinct from the small, sometimes green, sometimes silvery figures of the previous decade's encounter reports, and worlds apart from the tall, blonde, human-passing space brothers of the contactee movement. Betty also described what she interpreted, at the time and in later retellings, as a medical procedure involving a long needle inserted near her navel, which she was told, according to her hypnotic account, was a test to determine whether she was pregnant, a detail some later researchers have suggested resembles, with an unsettling degree of specificity for an early 1960s account, an amniocentesis-like procedure that would not become a widely known or commonly performed medical technique until years afterward. Perhaps the single most debated piece of physical evidence associated with the entire case emerged from a detail Betty recalled under hypnosis, being shown, by one of the beings, a 3-dimensional star map that she understood to depict trade routes between star systems. After the hypnosis sessions concluded, Betty produced a sketch of the map from memory. Years later, in 1969, an Ohio schoolteacher and amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish, working from published star catalogs and building a series of 3-dimensional models of nearby star systems by hand, proposed that Betty's star map corresponded, with a striking degree of accuracy, to the positions of the stars Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2 as seen from a vantage point among them, leading to the widespread popular association, still repeated across across UFO literature today between the Hill case and the Zeta Reticuli star system as an alleged point of origin for gray aliens. This correlation has been disputed extensively by professional astronomers, several of whom have argued that Fish's methodology involved a degree of selective star selection and interpretive flexibility that undermines the statistical significance of the match, and that similarly compelling patterns can be constructed from Betty's sketch using other, unrelated star groupings. The Zeta Reticuli connection remains to this day one of the most frequently cited and most frequently contested pieces of evidence in the entire history of ufology, treated by proponents as remarkable corroborating detail and by skeptics as a textbook case of pattern matching bias applied retroactively to an ambiguous hand-drawn sketch. The Hill case entered public consciousness in a major way with the 1966 publication of journalist John Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, which presented the case in extensive detail, including transcripts drawn from the Simon hypnosis sessions, and became a national bestseller, introducing millions of readers to a fully formed abduction narrative years before the word abduction had become the standard term for such claims. The case reached an even wider audience in 1975 with the broadcast of an NBC television film, The UFO Incident, starring James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons as Barney and Betty Hill, which dramatized the sighting and the hypnosis sessions for a mass television audience and is widely credited by researchers with cementing the gray alien's now iconic appearance in the American popular imagination, arguably doing more in a single broadcast to standardize the modern alien image than any single piece of testimony that came before it. The scientific and skeptical response to the Hill case has been substantial, sustained, and worth examining honestly, because the case sits at the center of one of the most important methodological debates in the entire field: the reliability of hypnotic regression as a tool for recovering memory. Dr. Benjamin Simon himself, despite conducting the sessions and clearly regarding the Hills as sincere and not consciously fabricating their accounts, ultimately concluded that the abduction narrative likely originated as a shared fantasy or dream, most probably rooted in Betty's anxiety-driven nightmares, which he believed Barney had absorbed and incorporated into his own account, whether consciously or not, during the period between the sighting and the hypnosis sessions. This is a critical detail often omitted from popular retellings of the case. The psychiatrist most directly involved in eliciting the testimony did not himself endorse the literal, extraterrestrial interpretation of what his patients described, even as he affirmed that they were not lying and were describing something they sincerely believed had happened to them. The broader scientific literature on hypnosis developed considerably in the decades following the Hill case, and what researchers have learned since the 1960s has been almost uniformly unfavorable to the use of hypnotic regression as a reliable method for recovering accurate memories of past events. Hypnosis has been repeatedly demonstrated in controlled research settings to increase a subject's confidence in recalled memories, without a corresponding increase in the accuracy of those memories, and hypnotized subjects have been shown to be considerably more susceptible than usual to incorporating suggestions, leading questions, and even entirely fabricated details, introduced, often unintentionally, by the hypnotist, into what the subject subsequently experiences and reports as genuine, deeply felt memory. This body of research, which we will examine in far greater depth in a later part of this series, devoted specifically to the psychology and neuroscience of the abduction experience, does not prove that the Hills fabricated or imagined their entire experience. It does establish, however, that hypnotic regression, the primary tool used to elicit not only the Hill testimony, but the vast majority of abduction accounts that followed over the next several decades, carries serious, scientifically documented risks of producing detailed, sincerely believed, and entirely inaccurate memories, a caution that responsible researchers on both sides of the debate now generally acknowledge. One additional detail has become a persistent, if disputed, talking point among skeptics of the case: 12 days before Barney Hill's hypnosis session, in which he first described the being's distinctive large wraparound eyes, the television anthology series The Outer Limits broadcast an episode titled The Bolero Shield, featuring an alien being with strikingly large, prominent eyes of a broadly similar description. Skeptics have proposed that Barney may have seen this broadcast and unconsciously incorporated its imagery into his hypnotically recovered account, whether directly or through Betty's own possible exposure to the same broadcast, feeding into the nightmares she had already been recording. Proponents of the case's authenticity have pushed back on this theory, noting that the physical description Barney gave under hypnosis differs from the television alien in a number of specific details, and arguing that the timeline and mechanism of unconscious influence being proposed remains speculative rather than demonstrated. As with so much of this case, no single piece of evidence definitively settles the question in either direction, and the Hill case endures 6 decades later as both one of the best documented and one of the most fiercely contested encounters in the entire history of the phenomenon. Whatever the ultimate explanation for what Betty and Barney Hill experienced on that New Hampshire highway, the case's historical significance to the mythology we are tracing in this documentary is not seriously in dispute. Before September 1961, the dominant public images of the alien visitor were the small, often described as green or silvery, largely mute figure of encounter cases like Kelly Hopkinsville, and the tall, blonde, talkative space brother of the contactee movement. After the Hill case became a national and then international sensation, a third image entered the cultural bloodstream and, over the following 2 decades, gradually eclipsed both of its predecessors, the gray, small, but not comically so, bald, with an oversized cranium, wraparound black eyes with no visible pupil, minimal facial features, cold, clinical, and interested not in delivering messages of peace, but in conducting what witnesses would increasingly describe, in case after case through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, as a physical examination, a shift in tone from contact to something closer to abduction and study that would come to define the phenomenon for the remainder of the 20th century. It is worth adding that the Hill case was, by the standards of UFO investigation at the time, unusually well documented from an early stage, which is part of why it has retained such lasting credibility even among researchers who remain skeptical of its ultimate explanation. Barney Hill held a position with the New Hampshire Advisory Board and had no discernible motive to seek out public attention, and by most contemporaneous accounts, the couple was deeply reluctant to have their story publicized at all, cooperating initially only with a small circle of UFO researchers and later with journalist John Fuller, out of a stated desire to understand their own experience rather than a desire for fame or profit. A pattern of reluctant, even resistant witnesses that recurs across many of the cases this documentary treats as most credible, and stands in some contrast to later decades of the abduction phenomenon, when public testimony, support groups, and media appearances became a far more normalized, and for some claimants far more actively sought, part of the abduction experience. The Hill case's influence extended well beyond ufology into the broader landscape of American popular culture, feeding directly into the visual language that Steven Spielberg would draw on for his 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and that countless films, television programs, and works of fiction would continue to draw on for decades afterward, to the point that the gray alien, largely absent from serious witness testimony before 1961, would within a generation become so thoroughly identified with the very concept of extraterrestrial life that surveys of the American public conducted decades later would find the gray to be, by a wide margin, the default image respondents pictured when asked simply to imagine an alien, eclipsing the green-skinned figure the phrase "little green men" technically describes. In the next part of this series, we follow that shift forward through the 1970s into 2 of the most significant and most publicly scrutinized cases of the decade. The 1973 encounter, reported by Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker on a fishing pier in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and the 1975 disappearance and reappearance of forestry worker Travis Walton in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest of Arizona. a case that would become the subject of intense investigation, a polygraph controversy, and eventually a major Hollywood film. And that helped establish the organized, systematic study of abduction claims as a distinct field within ufology. Pascagoula and the missing 5 days. Less than 2 years after the Hill case reached its widest audience through John Fuller's book, a second encounter occurred that would further complicate the picture of what exactly witnesses across the country were describing when they spoke of alien beings, and would demonstrate that the emerging gray archetype was, in the actual body of testimony being collected, considerably less uniform than popular culture would eventually suggest. On the evening of October the 11th, 1973, 2 shipyard workers, Charles Hickson, aged 42, and Calvin Parker, aged 19, were fishing from an old pier on the Pascagoula River in Mississippi when they reported hearing a strange whirring or buzzing sound and turned to see a glowing, egg-shaped or oblong craft hovering just above the ground nearby. According to their nearly identical accounts, given separately in the hours and days that followed, 3 creatures emerged from the craft, moving not by walking, but by what the men described as a floating or gliding motion, roughly humanoid in overall shape, but strikingly different from the beings described in either the contactee tradition or the Hill case. Hickson and Parker described the beings as approximately 5 feet tall, with gray, wrinkled skin they compared to an elephant's hide. No visible neck, slits where eyes and a mouth should be, and hands that ended not in fingers, but in crab-like claws or pincers. Both men reported being seized, paralyzed by what they described as a numbing sensation, and floated or carried aboard the craft, where they were separated and subjected to an examination by a device Hickson later described as resembling a large mechanical eye, which moved slowly over his body. The entire encounter, by their account, lasted approximately 20 minutes before the 2 men found themselves back on the pier, with the craft departing at high speed. What happened next is a significant part of why the Pascagoula case has retained unusual credibility among researchers who otherwise treat most abduction testimony with considerable caution. Badly shaken, Hickson and Parker drove immediately to the local Keesler Air Force Base, and when they found it closed for the night, went instead to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, where they gave an account to Sheriff Fred Diamond and his deputies that the responding officers described in later interviews as displaying visible, seemingly genuine shock and distress, difficult in the sheriff's own assessment to fake convincingly, in a detail that has become one of the most cited pieces of circumstantial evidence in the entire case. The investigating officers, skeptical of the story but uncertain how to proceed, left the 2 men alone in an interrogation room with a hidden tape recorder running, hoping to catch them coordinating a fabricated story once they believed themselves unobserved. The recording, later made public, instead captured Hickson attempting to calm a visibly distraught and frightened Parker, with both men's private, unguarded conversation remaining entirely consistent with the account they had already given, a result that surprised the investigating officers and that ufologists have pointed to for decades afterward as compelling behavioral evidence, whatever the ultimate cause of the 2 men's distress may have been. The case received rapid national and even international media attention, and both men underwent subsequent scrutiny that split along now familiar lines. Hickson submitted to hypnosis, conducted by psychologists affiliated with the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, one of the leading civilian UFO investigation groups of the era, and his hypnotically recovered account remained broadly consistent with his original, non-hypnotized testimony. He also passed a polygraph examination administered in connection with the case. Parker, considerably younger and by most accounts more deeply traumatized by the experience, suffered what witnesses described as a nervous breakdown in the weeks following the encounter and was unable to complete a polygraph examination at the time, a gap in the documented record that skeptics have pointed to as an evidentiary weakness, while researchers sympathetic to the case have argued that Parker's acute psychological distress is itself difficult to reconcile with a simple hoax, particularly given that he largely withdrew from public life and avoided the media attention that Hickson, by contrast, engaged with at length for years afterward, including through a book detailing the encounter. Skeptical investigators, including the astronomer and prominent UFO skeptic Philip Klass, raised pointed questions about inconsistencies in Hickson's later retellings of the story and about his subsequent involvement in additional, less well-corroborated UFO claims, which they argued undermined his credibility as a witness, a criticism proponents of the case counter by noting that Klass's broader body of debunking work has itself been criticized by other researchers for selectively emphasizing weaknesses in cases while downplaying comparably strong points. What matters most, for the purposes of this documentary, is the physical description the two men gave, because it complicates any simple, unified account of what the gray alien archetype actually consists of in the historical testimony record. Where Betty Hill described smooth gray skin, a large hairless cranium, and enormous wraparound eyes with essentially no other facial features, Hickson and Parker described wrinkled, elephant-like skin, claw-like or pincer hands, and a gliding rather than walking method of movement, with far less emphasis on large eyes and considerably more emphasis on a mechanical, almost robotic quality to the being's movement and behavior. Some researchers have proposed that this variation reflects genuinely different categories of being, perhaps a difference between the beings actually encountered and a distinct category of robotic or synthetic entity or biological drone used by an advanced visiting intelligence to perform physical tasks rather than direct interaction, a hypothesis impossible to confirm but frequently raised in the more speculative corners of ufological literature. Skeptics offer a more parsimonious explanation that human testimony under conditions of extreme stress, whether describing a genuine anomalous experience or a hallucinatory or confabulated one, is inherently variable, and that expecting a single, consistent physical description to emerge from unrelated witnesses in different states of mind, different regions, and different decades imposes a standard of consistency that even mundane eyewitness testimony to ordinary crimes routinely fails to meet. 2 years after Pascagoula, a case emerged in rural Arizona that would become, in terms of sheer public notoriety, one of the most famous alleged abductions in American history, rivaled only by the Hill case itself, and that introduced an entirely new evidentiary wrinkle into the ongoing debate. The disappearance for 5 full days of a living human being, witnessed by 6 co-workers, investigated by a manhunt involving dozens of law enforcement personnel, and never fully resolved to the satisfaction of either side of the debate. On the evening of November 5, 1975, a 7-man logging crew working under contract in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest was driving home from a job site when, according to the collective account given by all 7 men, they encountered a glowing, disc-shaped object hovering near the road. One member of the crew, 22-year-old Travis Walton, got out of the truck and approached the object on foot, against the shouted warnings of his co-workers, and was reportedly struck by a beam of light or energy emanating from the craft, which lifted him briefly off the ground before the object shot away. The remaining crew members, in a panic that several later described in terms of genuine, uncontrolled fear rather than calculated deception, fled the scene, and by the time crew foreman Mike Rogers worked up the resolve to return to the site, Walton was nowhere to be found. What followed was one of the largest search operations in Arizona history to that point, involving local sheriff's deputies, state police, search and rescue volunteers, and eventually the Air Force, none of whom found any trace of Walton over the following days. The case immediately drew law enforcement suspicion in a direction that had nothing to do with extraterrestrials. Investigators considered the possibility that Walton's co-workers had killed him, whether accidentally or deliberately, and fabricated the UFO story to cover up a crime, a theory given additional weight by the fact that the logging crew was behind schedule on a Forest Service contract with financial penalties attached, creating at least a plausible, mundane motive for the men to want an extraordinary explanation for a missing colleague. Under this cloud of suspicion, all 6 of the remaining crew members voluntarily submitted to polygraph examinations regarding Walton's disappearance, and 5 were assessed by the examiner as showing no indication of deception, with the 6th result recorded as inconclusive due to the subject's agitated emotional state rather than any indication of dishonesty, a result that, whatever one makes of the underlying UFO claim, argues strongly against the theory that the crew had murdered Walton and invented the story to explain it. 5 days after his disappearance, Travis Walton reappeared, disoriented, severely dehydrated, and reporting a memory of the intervening time that was, by his own account, deeply fragmented and in places entirely absent. Under subsequent hypnosis and in his own conscious recollections, Walton described regaining a hazy awareness aboard what he took to be a craft, surrounded by beings he described as short, roughly 5 feet tall, with large, hairless, bulbous heads and enormous, dark, lidless eyes, wearing loose orange-brown coverings, a description that aligns considerably more closely with the classic gray archetype established by the Hill case than with the wrinkled, claw-handed beings of Pascagoula. Itself another data point in the broader pattern of inconsistent physical description across cases. Walton also described a later portion of the experience involving taller, human-appearing beings who treated him gently and ultimately returned him to the location near where he had vanished, a detail that echoes, whether coincidentally or not, the human-appearing figures of the earlier contactee tradition, even within what is otherwise squarely an abduction rather than a contactee-style narrative. The Walton case became, and has remained, one of the most contested in the entire field, in part because of a widely publicized controversy involving a polygraph examination arranged by the television program The Amazing Kreskin, and more significantly, by a subsequent controversial examination associated with a national news broadcast, in which Walton reportedly performed poorly, a result his supporters have long argued was compromised by the specific examiner's methodology, and by the enormous psychological stress Walton was under from unrelenting, often hostile media scrutiny in the weeks following his return, while skeptics have pointed to the same failed examination as one of the strongest pieces of evidence against the case's authenticity. Philip Klass, the same skeptical investigator who scrutinized the Pascagoula case, conducted an extensive independent investigation into Walton and his family, raising questions about the family's prior interest in UFOs, and about inconsistencies he identified across various retellings of the story, conclusions that Walton and his supporters have disputed point by point in the decades since. The case's public profile was further amplified, and in the view of many researchers, further complicated as a piece of evidence by its adaptation into the 1993 Hollywood film Fire in the Sky, which took considerable creative license with the details of Walton's reported experience aboard the craft, dramatizing it in far more graphic and frightening terms than Walton's own published account, a divergence Walton himself has publicly noted and objected to. Taken together, the Pascagoula and Walton cases mark an important structural turning point in the story this documentary is telling. Both cases occurred in the mid-1970s. Both received significant law enforcement involvement and formal polygraph testing, a level of institutional scrutiny relatively rare in earlier cases. And both cases, despite that scrutiny, ended without a conclusive resolution accepted by both proponents and skeptics, a pattern that would recur across nearly every major abduction case for the remainder of the century. Equally significant, both cases contributed distinct and only partially overlapping physical descriptions to the broader cultural template of the alien visitor, undermining any simple narrative in which a single, consistent, gray alien image simply displaced the little green man in a clean, linear progression. What the historical testimony record actually shows, once examined case by case rather than through the flattening lens of popular culture, is a considerably messier picture, multiple distinct physical descriptions emerging from different witnesses in different regions, evaluated with inconsistent methods, and converging, if they converge at all, only in the broadest strokes: small in stature, large-headed, large-eyed, and unmistakably deliberately non-human. By the second half of the 1970s, the sheer volume of reported encounters, combined with high-profile cases like Pascagoula and Walton, had begun to attract the attention of researchers interested not in single, isolated incidents, but in the phenomenon as a whole, treated as a pattern worthy of systematic, ongoing investigation. Among these researchers, one name would come to dominate the field for the next 2 decades, and would do more than perhaps any other individual to formalize the abduction narrative into the structured, recognizable form it holds in popular culture today. A New York artist named Bud Hopkins, whose own brief UFO sighting in 1964 had grown, by the late 1970s, into a full-time second career investigating and cataloging abduction claims using hypnosis as his primary investigative tool, a choice that would prove, in the years that followed, to be both the foundation of an entire research movement and the source of some of the most serious scientific criticism ever leveled against it. Missing time. The abduction researchers. By the late 1970s, the scattered, case-by-case investigation of alien encounters that had characterized the field since Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting was giving way to something more systematic, and the figure most responsible for that shift was a respected New York painter and sculptor named Bud Hopkins, whose own path into the field began with a comparatively minor sighting of an unidentified object in 1964, an experience that gradually grew over the following 15 years into a consuming second career as an investigator. In 1981, Hopkins published Missing Time, a book that did more than perhaps any other single work to establish the methodology and vocabulary that would define abduction research for the next 2 decades. Hopkins proposed that a block of unaccounted-for time, however brief, experienced in connection with an unusual sighting or unexplained anxiety should itself be treated as a potential indicator of a suppressed or unrecalled abduction experience, and he argued that hypnosis, conducted not by clinical psychiatrists in the careful, cautious manner Dr. Benjamin Simon had used with the Hills, but by trained investigators working within the UFO research community itself, could reliably recover the true, buried memory of what had happened during that missing interval. This methodological choice, treating hypnosis as an investigative recovery tool available to lay researchers rather than a clinical technique to be used sparingly and cautiously by licensed professionals aware of its documented risks, became the defining and most consequential decision of the entire abduction research movement, and it is difficult to overstate how significant this shift proved to be. Where the Hill case had involved a psychiatrist who, even as he elicited a detailed abduction narrative, ultimately expressed professional skepticism about its literal accuracy, the movement Hopkins built increasingly involved investigators who approached each hypnosis session already convinced that abduction was real, common, and simply unrecalled by the conscious mind, a starting assumption that memory researchers would later identify as one of the most serious sources of contamination in the entire body of testimony the movement produced. Hopkins followed Missing Time with a second and even more influential book in 1987, Intruders, which introduced what would become one of the single most consequential ideas in the entire history of the abduction narrative. The claim, drawn from a pattern Hopkins identified across dozens of his hypnotically regressed subjects, that abductions were not isolated, random events, but part of an ongoing, multi-generational program involving the systematic collection of human reproductive material, the gestation of hybrid offspring combining human and alien genetic material, and repeated follow-up abductions in which the same human subjects were shown, and in some accounts asked to hold or comfort hybrid children the subjects came to believe were genetically their own. This hybrid program narrative, which we will examine in far greater depth later in this series when we turn specifically to the question of alien agenda and purpose, effectively reoriented the entire abduction mythology away from the earlier, comparatively simple framework of observation or scientific curiosity and towards something considerably darker and more purposeful, a decades-long, covert breeding program conducted without meaningful human consent, driven by a biological or genetic imperative on the part of the visiting species. Whether one regards this narrative as a genuine, if deeply unsettling, pattern in real testimony, or as a striking example of how a small number of influential researchers can shape and standardize the content of subsequent testimony through the questions they ask and the expectations they bring into a hypnosis session, the hybrid program concept became, through Hopkins's enormous influence over the field, close to a default assumption in mainstream abduction research by the early 1990s, appearing with remarkable consistency in testimony collected by investigators working independently of Hopkins across the country, a consistency that proponents cite as corroboration and that skeptics attribute to the by-then widespread cultural absorption of a narrative Hopkins himself had done more than anyone to popularize. Hopkins's work coincided with and was substantially amplified by the publication in 1987 of a book that would become the single best-selling and most culturally influential abduction narrative ever published, Whitley Strieber's Communion. Strieber, an established horror and thriller novelist with no prior public involvement in ufology, presented the book as a non-fiction account of his own abduction experiences, beginning with an encounter at his family's cabin in upstate New York in December of 1985, and involving, across the narrative, examination by being Strieber described in considerable, often disturbing physical and psychological detail. Communion spent months on bestseller lists and introduced an enormous global audience to the specific, distinctive image of the gray alien face that appeared on its cover, painted by the artist Ted J. Seth Riccio based on Strieber's own description. And that image, more than any single photograph, sketch, or piece of testimony that preceded it, effectively became the fixed, universally recognized visual shorthand for alien in Western popular culture for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st, reproduced, parodied, and referenced so widely that its origin in one man's disputed, hypnotically assisted memory of a single encounter is now almost entirely disconnected in the public mind from the image itself. Strieber's account, notably, was considerably more ambiguous about the ultimate nature and origin of his visitors than either the Hopkins hybrid program narrative or the classic extraterrestrial framework generally assumed by the field. Strieber described the beings using language that occasionally suggested something closer to a psychological, spiritual, or even interdimensional encounter than a straightforward alien visitation, and he resisted, in interviews given across the following decades, any simple or definitive claim about who or what his visitors actually were, a stance that put him at odds with parts of the more literal-minded UFO research community, even as his book did more than any other single work to popularize their subject matter to a mainstream audience. The cumulative cultural impact of Hopkins's research and Strieber's bestseller led, in 1991 and 1992, to one of the more ambitious and more heavily criticized attempts to quantify the scope of the phenomenon. A national survey commissioned with funding connected to Hopkins and to the Roper Organization, a respected mainstream polling firm, intended to estimate how many Americans might have experienced an unrecognized alien abduction. Rather than asking respondents directly whether they had been abducted by aliens, a question researchers recognized would produce unreliable results. The survey instead asked about a set of specific experiences that Hopkins and his collaborators had identified, based on years of case investigation, as potential indicators of a suppressed abduction memory. Waking up paralyzed with a sense of a strange figure or presence in the room, experiencing an unaccounted for period of time, waking up with unexplained scars or marks on the body, and several similar items. Respondents who answered affirmatively to a sufficient number of these indicator questions were then classified in the survey's published analysis as likely abductees, and the resulting extrapolation suggested that as many as several million Americans might have experienced an abduction they did not consciously remember. This survey and its methodology were subjected to sustained and largely devastating criticism from statisticians, psychologists, and sociologists in the years that followed, criticism that remains, decades later, essentially unanswered by the survey's original proponents. The core problem, critics pointed out, is that every one of the specific indicator experiences used in the survey has a well-documented, common, and entirely mundane explanation unrelated to alien contact. Waking paralysis with a sense of presence is a textbook description of sleep paralysis, a genuinely common and well-studied neurological phenomenon affecting a significant portion of the general population at some point in their lives. Unexplained marks on the body are, for the overwhelming majority of people, unremarkable and readily explained by ordinary causes that go unnoticed or unremembered, and a subjective sense of missing time is a common and generally benign experience of everyday memory, particularly during monotonous activities like long-distance driving, the very context in which the Hill case itself began. By treating a cluster of common, largely unrelated human experiences as evidence of a specific, extraordinary cause, without first establishing any independent, non-circular connection between the indicator experiences and actual abduction claims, critics argued, the Roper survey's methodology all but guaranteed an inflated result, and its widely reported headline figures have been treated with considerable skepticism by working social scientists ever since, even as the raw numbers continue to circulate in popular UFO literature as though they represented a rigorously established finding. The most consequential and most professionally fraught chapter of this era involves a figure whose credentials made his engagement with the subject impossible for the broader academic and medical establishment to simply dismiss. John Mack, a tenured professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer who began, in the late 1980s, to interview and treat patients who reported abduction experiences, applying his considerable clinical expertise and academic standing to a subject that had, until that point, existed almost entirely outside serious institutional medicine. Mack's 1994 book, Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens, presented detailed case studies of dozens of his patients and argued, carefully and with considerably more nuance than most popular treatments of his work suggested, that the abduction experience represented something psychologically real and worthy of serious study, whatever its ultimate metaphysical explanation, and that the experiences he documented could not, in his clinical judgment, be adequately explained away as simple fantasy, mental illness, or the product of leading hypnotic technique alone. Mack's engagement with the subject triggered an almost unprecedented institutional response. In 1994, Harvard Medical School convened a formal ad hoc committee, reportedly the first such review in the medical school's history, directed at a tenured faculty member's clinical and research conduct rather than at questions of academic misconduct in the traditional sense, to examine Mack's methodology and his treatment of the patients involved in his research. The 14-month investigation that followed drew intense national media attention and became, in its own right, a significant episode in the broader history of how mainstream academic and medical institutions have handled researchers willing to engage seriously with topics widely regarded as fringe. The committee ultimately did not revoke Mack's tenure, his faculty position, or his medical license, and issued a final report reaffirming his academic freedom to pursue the research, while nonetheless raising pointed concerns about aspects of his clinical methodology, including his use of hypnosis and the degree to which his own evident openness to the reality of his patients' experiences may have shaped the therapeutic relationship in ways that risked reinforcing, rather than neutrally investigating, the abduction narrative his patients presented. Mack continued his research until his death in a car accident in 2004, and he remains, for supporters of the phenomenon, the single most credible mainstream figure ever to take the subject seriously, and for skeptics, a cautionary example of how even rigorous, well-credentialed academic training does not fully inoculate a researcher against the pull of a compelling, emotionally powerful narrative. The controversy surrounding Hopkins, Strieber, Mack, and the broader abduction research movement of the 1980s and 90s cannot be fully understood in isolation from a parallel and, in retrospect, deeply revealing episode unfolding in American psychology and popular culture during the exact same years. The so-called Satanic Panic, in which a wave of claims involving recovered memories of ritual abuse, often elicited through hypnosis and other suggestive therapeutic techniques by well-meaning but methodologically unrigorous therapists, swept through the American mental health and legal systems before collapsing, over the course of the 1990s, under the weight of careful scientific scrutiny into the reliability of recovered memory. Memory researchers, most prominently the cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, conducted a substantial body of experimental research during this period demonstrating, with considerable rigor, that human memory is not a fixed recording that can be accurately retrieved through hypnosis or other recovery techniques, but a reconstructive process highly susceptible to suggestion, and that entirely false memories of events that never occurred could be reliably implanted in otherwise psychologically healthy research subjects through techniques strikingly similar to those used by both recovered memory therapists and abduction researchers of the same era. This body of research does not, on its own, prove that every abduction memory recovered through hypnosis is false. It does establish, with a weight of scientific evidence that has only grown stronger in the decades since, that the specific methodology at the heart of the entire Hopkins-era abduction research movement carries a well-documented, scientifically demonstrated risk of producing detailed, sincere, and entirely inaccurate memories. A caution that responsible researchers across the field, including some sympathetic to the broader UFO phenomenon, now generally accept as a serious limitation on the evidentiary value of hypnotically recovered abduction testimony. A related line of psychological research developed by investigators including Nicholas Spanos in the 1990s examined whether individuals who report abduction experiences share identifiable underlying psychological traits, and found that self-reported abductees scored, on average, notably higher than control populations on measures of what psychologists call fantasy proneness, a well-documented personality dimension characterized by a rich, vivid, inner imaginative life, heightened hypnotic susceptibility, and a greater tendency to experience vivid, immersive, and convincingly realistic mental imagery, including during sleep-related and hypnotic states. Importantly, this research does not suggest that abduction claimants are mentally ill or unusually prone to lying. Fantasy proneness is understood as a normal personality variation found throughout the general population, associated in various studies with creativity and artistic ability as much as with anomalous experience. But the finding provided a coherent, evidence-based psychological explanation for why a specific subset of the population might be more likely, under the right cultural and therapeutic conditions, to construct, sincerely believe, and vividly recall detailed abduction narratives without requiring any actual encounter with an extraterrestrial being to explain the underlying experience. By the mid-1990s then, the abduction phenomenon had produced two starkly divergent bodies of expert opinion, both grounded in genuine research rather than casual dismissal or credulous acceptance. One body of work, running from Hopkins through Strieber through Mack, took the consistency and emotional sincerity of abduction testimony as evidence that something real, unexplained, and worthy of serious study was occurring. The other, running from Loftus through Spanos and the broader memory science community, demonstrated with considerable experimental rigor that the specific methods used to elicit that testimony were uniquely capable of producing detailed, convincing, and entirely false memories, whether or not any genuine underlying phenomenon existed at all. This documentary does not claim to resolve that divide, and honest treatment of the subject requires acknowledging that neither body of research fully answers the other. What both sides of the debate agree on, however, is that by the 1990s, the alien abduction narrative and the small, gray, large-eyed being at its center had become one of the most thoroughly documented, most widely believed, and most scientifically contested phenomena in modern American life. Roswell, the incident and the myth it became. No single event in the history of this subject carries more cultural weight, more competing claims, and more genuine documentary confusion than what happened or did not happen on a remote sheep ranch outside Roswell, New Mexico in the first weeks of July 1947. To understand why Roswell occupies the singular place it does in the popular imagination, it is essential to separate, as carefully as the historical record allows, three distinct things that have become thoroughly fused together in popular retelling. The documented events of July 1947 themselves, the 30-year period of near-total public silence that followed, and the elaborate, steadily expanding mythology that emerged only after 1978. More than a decade after the Hill case, the contactee movement and the earliest abduction researchers had already established much of the vocabulary and visual imagination the later Roswell testimony would draw upon. The documented events begin in mid-June of 1947, when a rancher named William Mack Brazel discovered an unusual field of debris scattered across a remote section of the Foster homestead he managed, roughly 75 miles northwest of Roswell. The material, by Brazel's own contemporaneous description, consisted of rubber strips, tinfoil, tough paper, and sticks, some of it bearing what he described as flower-patterned tape. Debris that Brazel initially found strange enough to mention to neighbors, but not at first urgent enough to report immediately. It was only after Brazel heard growing radio and newspaper coverage of the nationwide flying saucer sightings that had followed Kenneth Arnold's Mount Rainier report earlier that same month that he decided to report his discovery to Chaves County Sheriff George Wilcox, who in turn contacted the intelligence office at the nearby Roswell Army Airfield, home at the time to the 509th Bomb Group, the only operational nuclear weapons-capable unit in the world. Major Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer, was dispatched to examine and collect the debris, and it is what happened next that transformed an obscure ranch debris field into the most famous UFO story in history. On July the 8th, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield's Public Information Office released a press statement, quoted directly in the following day's edition of the Roswell Daily Record under the now famous headline, "RAF Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell Region," announcing that the base had recovered the wreckage of a crashed flying disc. This detail is worth sitting with because it is the single most important documented fact underpinning the entire Roswell mystery, and it is not disputed by any serious historian, skeptic, or believer. An official United States military public affairs office at the height of the very first nationwide flying saucer panic formally announced to the press that it had recovered a crashed flying disc. Within roughly 24 hours, this announcement was retracted and replaced with a considerably less sensational explanation. Base Commander Colonel William Blanchard's superior officers in Fort Worth, Texas, announced that the recovered material was in fact the wreckage of a conventional weather balloon and its attached radar reflector, and Jesse Marcel himself was photographed for the press, smiling, kneeling beside debris identified as balloon wreckage, a set of images that would later become central exhibits in the mythology's revival 3 decades later. For nearly 30 years after that July 1947 retraction, the Roswell incident remained a minor, largely forgotten footnote in the broader history of American UFO reporting, rarely mentioned even in dedicated ufological literature of the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, which tended to focus far more attention on cases like Kelly Hopkinsville, the contactee movement, and the Hill abduction. This decades-long dormancy is itself an important and often underappreciated fact because it means the elaborate body of detailed witness testimony that most people today associate with Roswell, recovered alien bodies, secret military convoys, threatened witnesses, and a coordinated decades-long cover-up, did not exist in anything like its modern form until long after the original event, raising an unavoidable methodological question this documentary must address directly. How much of that later testimony represents genuinely suppressed memory finally surfacing after decades of fear-induced silence, as proponents argue? And how much represents the ordinary, well-documented human tendency for memory to become elaborated, reconstructed, and unconsciously merged with intervening cultural material over a span of 30, 40, or in some cases, more than 50 years. The Roswell case's revival began in 1978 when nuclear physicist and prominent ufologist Stanton Friedman, who had built a career investigating and lecturing on UFO cases since the 1960s, tracked down and interviewed the now retired Jesse Marcel. In this interview and in subsequent ones, Marcel offered an account sharply at odds with his 1947 public statements, describing the recovered debris as exhibiting highly unusual physical properties, including metal that could not be dented, cut, or burned, and that returned to its original shape after being crumpled, and characterizing the weather balloon explanation as a cover story he had been ordered to participate in, including, by his account, being asked to pose for press photographs beside genuine balloon wreckage that had been substituted for the original, stranger material he had personally collected at the ranch. Friedman's investigation and the 1980 book, The Roswell Incident, co-written by Charles Berlitz and William Moore, transformed the case from an obscure footnote into a subject of major national and eventually international fascination, and over the following 2 decades, an expanding roster of additional witnesses came forward with testimony that grew progressively more elaborate, claims of a second, separate debris and body recovery site, claims that recovered bodies, and in some accounts one surviving being, were transported to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and the widely circulated account of mortician Glenn Dennis, who claimed he had been contacted by Roswell base personnel making inquiries about small, child-sized, hermetically sealable caskets, and had separately heard second-hand accounts from a nurse, who Dennis said later disappeared from the base entirely, describing an autopsy conducted on non-human bodies. This progressive accumulation of testimony, much of it collected decades after the fact by investigators who, by the 1980s and 90s, were already deeply invested in the case's extraordinary interpretation, has drawn sustained and pointed criticism from historians and skeptical researchers who note that Glenn Dennis's specific claims, among the most dramatic and widely repeated details in the entire Roswell mythology, could never be independently corroborated, that the nurse he described could not be located or identified despite extensive searching, and that several of Dennis's specific factual claims about base personnel and procedures were directly contradicted by military records. Proponents of the extraordinary interpretation counter that the progressive emergence of testimony over decades is exactly what one would expect from witnesses operating under genuine fear of a security-related cover story, citing specific claimed instances of witnesses reporting they had been warned, threatened, or sworn to secrecy by military personnel in 1947. Threats these witnesses said they only felt able to discuss once they were elderly, retired, or, in some cases, already facing terminal illness. The controversy prompted a formal government response in the mid-1990s, initiated not by UFO researchers, but by New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff, who, after being repeatedly stonewalled in his own attempts to obtain a clear answer from the Air Force about the case on behalf of his constituents, requested a formal investigation by the General Accounting Office. This request prompted the Air Force to conduct its own internal review, resulting in a 1994 report that offered, for the first time, a detailed and specific alternative explanation for the original debris. Project Mogul, a highly classified program unknown to the public in 1947 and for decades afterward, that used high-altitude balloon trains carrying acoustic sensors designed to detect atmospheric sound waves from anticipated Soviet nuclear weapons tests. According to the Air Force's account, one of these balloon trains, constructed using neoprene balloons, aluminum foil radar reflectors reinforced with sticks resembling kite frames, and reflective tape, some of it bearing a flower-like printed pattern from the manufacturer, had crashed and scattered across the Foster Ranch, and its highly unusual, at the time genuinely unfamiliar construction, combined with the program's Cold War-era classification, could plausibly account for both Brazel's description of strange material and the military's evident urgency in quickly recovering and then obscuring the debris' true origin, since acknowledging a classified nuclear detection program would have been considerably more damaging to national security in 1947 than allowing a brief, quickly retracted flying disc story to fade into local curiosity. The Air Force's mogul explanation has been embraced by most mainstream historians and skeptical investigators as the most probable explanation for the original July 1947 debris field, and it does account, with reasonable precision, for several of the material's most specific and puzzling documented characteristics, as described by Brazel and by contemporaneous 1947 witnesses. It notably does not, on its own, explain the alien body claims that dominate the modern popular understanding of the case, and the Air Force addressed this gap directly in a 1997 follow-up report titled The Roswell Report Case Closed, which proposed that later witness testimony describing recovered bodies had become, over decades of retelling, conflated with two entirely separate and much later events. High-altitude parachute test programs conducted in the region during the 1950s using anthropomorphic test dummies, which bore a passing resemblance to the small, bald, large-eyed description that had, by the time of the later interviews, become the culturally dominant image of an alien being, and a 1956 KC-97 aircraft accident near Roswell that resulted in the deaths of 11 airmen, an event some researchers proposed could have contributed source material to second-hand accounts of injured or deceased bodies being recovered from a crash site in the region. This explanation has been met with considerable skepticism even among researchers who otherwise accept the mogul balloon explanation for the original debris, and the criticism is worth taking seriously on its own terms rather than dismissing reflexively. The anthropomorphic dummy tests the Air Force cited did not begin until the 1950s, fully a decade after the 1947 incident, and the witnesses whose testimony the report was attempting to explain were, in most cases, specifically describing events they placed in the summer of 1947, not the following decade, a chronological gap the Air Force's own report acknowledged but attributed to the ordinary, well-documented human tendency for memories from an eventful period of one's life to become telescoped and merged together over many decades of retelling, an explanation memory researchers regard as plausible in principle, but that Roswell proponents regard as a convenient and unfalsifiable way to dismiss any inconvenient detail in the witness record. No discussion of the modern Roswell mythology would be complete without addressing one of the most notorious and most thoroughly debunked artifacts in its history, the so-called alien autopsy footage produced and distributed by British entrepreneur Ray Santilli beginning in 1995, purporting to show authentic black and white film of a medical examination conducted on a recovered non-human body from the Roswell crash. The footage aired to enormous audiences on the Fox television network and was, for a period, treated as one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence in the entire field. It was subjected to extensive analysis by film historians, special effects artists, and forensic pathologists, virtually all of whom identified numerous inconsistencies with genuine 1947-era medical and film production techniques. And in 2006, Santilli publicly acknowledged that the footage released to the public had been substantially reconstructed and staged, though he maintained, without independent corroboration, that this reconstruction was based on a small number of genuine, badly deteriorated frames he claimed to have once possessed. The episode stands, regardless of Santilli's disputed underlying claims, as one of the clearest documented examples of outright hoaxing intersecting with the broader Roswell mythology, and it did lasting damage to the credibility of the case among serious researchers, even those inclined to take the underlying terrifying 1947 debris field seriously as a genuine unresolved question. Taken as a whole, the Roswell case occupies a uniquely difficult position in the story this documentary is telling because unlike almost every other case we have examined, it combines a genuinely documented, officially announced, and officially retracted government statement, an undisputed fact that alone justifies decades of public suspicion, with a body of supporting witness testimony collected so long after the fact, under such intensely charged cultural conditions, and by investigators so thoroughly invested in a particular extraordinary conclusion that separating a possible authentic core from decades of accumulated elaboration may simply no longer be achievable through historical investigation alone. What can be said with confidence is this: something unusual happened on the Foster Ranch in the summer of 1947. The United States military's own public statements about that event are demonstrably inconsistent, and a plausible, evidence-supported conventional explanation exists for at least the original physical debris, even as significant elements of the later, far more famous testimony about bodies, cover-ups, and hidden truths remain more than 75 years later, neither conclusively proven nor conclusively disproven. It was this same combination, official secrecy meeting, public suspicion meeting, genuinely unresolved detail, that gave rise, beginning in the late 1980s, to one of the most elaborate and most disputed claims in the entire history of American UFO research: the assertion that a secret committee of 12 senior government, military, and scientific officials had been established by presidential order in the immediate aftermath of Roswell to manage recovered alien technology and biological material on a permanent, ongoing basis. Majestic 12 and the architecture of secrecy. If the Roswell revival of the late 1970s and early 1980s gave the modern UFO cover-up narrative its founding incident, it was a set of documents that surfaced in 1984 that gave that narrative its founding conspiracy, complete with names, dates, and an alleged organizational chart of exactly who, within the United States government, had supposedly known the truth from the very beginning. In December of 1984, a roll of undeveloped 35mm film arrived, unsolicited and with no return address, at the home of Chaimi Shandura, a Los Angeles television producer and UFO researcher with close ties to Stanton Friedman and William Moore, the same researchers who had driven the Roswell revival. When developed, the film revealed images of an 8-page document dated November the 18th, 1952, and presented as a top-secret briefing paper prepared for incoming President-elect Dwight Eisenhower, describing a covert committee established by presidential order under Harry Truman in September of 1947 in the immediate aftermath of the Roswell recovery, tasked with managing scientific and intelligence matters related to recovered extraterrestrial technology and, in the document's own language, off-world biological entities. The document identified this committee by the code name Majestic 12 and listed 12 named members, including genuinely real and historically significant figures such as Vannevar Bush, the wartime head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, and Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first director of the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. The Majestic 12 documents, quickly nicknamed MJ-12 within the ufological community, represented, if genuine, the single most significant piece of documentary evidence ever produced in support of the extraordinary interpretation of Roswell and of a broader, formally organized government cover-up extending to the highest levels of American national security leadership. Unsurprisingly, given the stakes involved, the documents were subjected to an extraordinarily intense period of forensic and historical scrutiny over the following decade, conducted not only by skeptical debunkers, but by serious researchers within the UFO community itself, several of whom had initially treated the documents as a potentially landmark discovery before ultimately concluding, based on the accumulating evidence, that they could not be genuine. The case against the document's authenticity, as it developed through the late 1980s and 1990s, rested on several independent and mutually reinforcing lines of evidence. Forensic document examiners identified that the signature attributed to Harry Truman on the MJ-12 papers was, in its precise stroke pattern and slant, an essentially exact match to a genuine, previously known and independently verifiable Truman signature found on an unrelated 1947 memo, a level of precision far beyond what any two authentic signatures by the same person, signed on different occasions, would naturally produce, strongly suggesting that the Truman signature on the MJ-12 document had been mechanically reproduced or traced from the known, genuine memo rather than freshly signed. Researchers, including some prominent UFO investigators who had no particular skeptical agenda and were, if anything, disappointed by their own findings, further identified anachronistic formatting inconsistent with actual 1947 and 1952 era classified government document conventions, along with a related batch of supplementary MJ-12 materials that surfaced in subsequent years containing an even more damning error: the use of a zip code on a document dated years before the United States Postal Service introduced the zip code system in 1963. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, asked by a separate government agency in the late 1980s to examine one version of the documents that had surfaced through official channels, conducted its own review and found no evidence that authentic government records supporting the document's existence could be located, and ultimately, following its own investigative protocols, closed the matter without identifying a specific author or hoaxer. Even among researchers deeply committed to the broader UFO cover-up narrative, the consensus that eventually emerged, and that remains the dominant view within serious ufological research today, is that the specific MJ-12 documents that surfaced in 1984 are almost certainly a fabrication, likely produced by someone within or close to the UFO research community itself, given the documents' detailed familiarity with existing ufological claims and their apparent intent to provide long-sought documentary confirmation for a narrative that researchers like Friedman and Moore had already been actively investigating and, some later critics alleged, may have been positioned to benefit from professionally and financially. William Moore himself, in a controversial public admission at a UFO conference in 1989, acknowledged having worked with Air Force intelligence contacts on a disinformation-related project during this period, though he denied personally fabricating the MJ-12 documents, an admission that further muddied an already deeply contested chapter of the field's history and left open the unsettling possibility that at least some portion of the era's most famous evidentiary documents had been deliberately seeded into the research community, whether by a hoaxer acting alone or, as some researchers continue to allege without conclusive proof, by intelligence community sources engaged in an active effort to manipulate and discredit UFO research from within. It is worth pausing on that last possibility because it points to a genuinely documented feature of Cold War-era American intelligence practice that complicates any simple, one-directional account of the UFO cover-up narrative. Declassified CIA and Air Force records confirm that American intelligence agencies did, during the 1950s and 1960s, take an active interest in UFO reports, not primarily because officials believed they represented extraterrestrial visitors, but because a substantial and now well-documented portion of unexplained aerial sightings during this exact period were, in fact, sightings of genuinely secret American reconnaissance aircraft. The U-2 spy plane, which began high-altitude test and operational flights in the mid-1950s, and its even faster successor, the A-12 and SR-71 Blackbird program developed under the CIA project name Oxcart, flew at altitudes and speeds far beyond any civilian or conventional military aircraft of the era, and their highly reflective, unusual airframes, catching sunlight at extreme altitude in ways unfamiliar to ground observers and civil aviation controllers, generated a substantial volume of the very unidentified flying object reports that Project Blue Book was, at the same time, publicly investigating. A declassified CIA history released in 1997 explicitly acknowledged that agency officials estimated a very significant proportion of UFO reports during the height of the U-2 and Oxcart flight programs could be attributed to sightings of these classified aircraft, and that Air Force investigators were, in many specific cases, aware of the true explanation but unable to state it publicly without compromising an active, highly classified intelligence intelligence program, leaving Blue Book investigators in the genuinely uncomfortable position of publicly offering unsatisfying or incomplete explanations for sightings whose real cause they privately knew but were forbidden to disclose. This is, in the assessment of many serious historians of the field, one of the single most important and most underappreciated dynamics in the entire history of American UFO secrecy, that genuine, well-documented government secrecy undertaken for entirely conventional Cold War military and intelligence reasons having nothing to do with extraterrestrial visitors, produced exactly the pattern of official evasion, unsatisfying explanation, and visible discomfort from government spokespeople that the public, quite reasonably, interpreted as evidence of a much larger and more exotic cover-up. Real secrecy, in other words, appears to have substantially fueled public suspicion of an imagined, larger secrecy, a dynamic that becomes directly relevant to the single most famous physical location associated with alleged government UFO secrecy, the remote military installation in the Nevada desert, popularly known as Area 51. The facility, formerly part of the Nevada Test and Training Range and centered on a dry lakebed called Groom Lake, was established in 1955 specifically to provide a secure remote testing location for the U-2 program, and it continued to serve as the primary testing site for a succession of the United States' most sensitive classified aircraft programs over the following decades, including the Oxcart Blackbird program and later early stealth aircraft prototypes developed under highly classified programs in the late 1970s and 1980s. For nearly 6 decades, the United States government maintained an official policy of neither confirming nor denying the facility's existence at all, a posture of extreme, almost absurdist secrecy that persisted even as the base's approximate location, activities, and even its name were widely known and openly discussed in the surrounding region, in aviation enthusiast literature, and eventually in mainstream media, and that was only formally acknowledged in any official government document with the 2013 release, following a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit filed by the National Security Archive of a declassified CIA internal history that explicitly named and described the Area 51 facility for the first time in the agency's own official record. This decades-long, almost theatrical level of official secrecy surrounding what were, however genuinely classified, ultimately conventional aircraft testing programs created an almost perfectly optimized environment for UFO mythology to flourish. And no single individual did more to fuse Area 51, specifically to the alien cover-up narrative, than a man named Bob Lazar, who came forward in 1989, claiming to have worked as a physicist at a facility he identified as S4, located near Groom Lake, where he claimed to have been employed to help reverse engineer captured extraterrestrial spacecraft as part of a secret government program. Lazar's specific claims were extraordinarily detailed, including descriptions of 9 distinct alien craft he claimed to have personally observed, technical claims about an anti-gravity propulsion system supposedly powered by a stable super-heavy element he identified by the atomic number 115, and first-hand accounts of a test flight of one of the recovered craft that he claimed to have witnessed. Lazar's claims received significant media attention, including an extended interview on Las Vegas television, and he remains, to this day, one of the most widely cited and most consequential figures in the entire mythology of Area 51 as a site of active alien technology research. Lazar's credibility has been the subject of sustained and largely unresolved dispute since his claims first surfaced. Investigative journalists were unable to locate any employment, enrollment, or degree records confirming his claimed education at MIT or Caltech, both institutions stating they had no record of him ever having attended, and no independent documentation has ever surfaced confirming his claimed employment at the S4 facility itself, a gap Lazar and his supporters attribute to the deliberate, thorough erasure of his records by the same government agencies he claims to have exposed, and that skeptics attribute to the more straightforward possibility that the records do not exist because the claimed employment did not occur. In an intriguing footnote that Lazar's supporters frequently cite as partial vindication, a genuinely new super-heavy element with the atomic number 115 was successfully synthesized by an international team of physicists in 2003, later officially named moscovium, though the element's actual measured properties, in particular its extreme instability and near instantaneous radioactive decay, differ substantially from the stable, exotic power source properties Lazar had originally described, a discrepancy skeptics regard as effectively disproving the specific technical claim, even as it superficially appears to validate Lazar's general foresight about an undiscovered element bearing that atomic number. Whatever the ultimate truth of Lazar's specific claims, his testimony, combined with the documented decades-long official secrecy surrounding Groom Lake, cemented Area 51 as the physical geographic center of the entire government cover-up mythology, a status reflected in the surrounding Nevada highway's official 1996 redesignation as the Extraterrestrial Highway, in a sustained tourism economy built around the base's mystique and in the base's continued function, whatever is or is not actually tested there today, as the primary cultural symbol, more than any other single location on Earth, of the belief that governments possess, study, and deliberately conceal knowledge of non-human visitors, technology, or, in the most extreme versions of the narrative circulating today, living extraterrestrial beings themselves. The question of purpose: what do they want? Every category of testimony we have examined so far, the frightened farmhouse siege at Kelly Hopkinsville, the benevolent lectures of the contactees, the clinical examinations described by Betty and Barney Hill, and the darker, more institutionalized abduction narratives developed by Bud Hopkins and his successors, converges eventually on a single unanswered question that sits at the very center of this entire mythology. If these visitors are real, what, exactly, are they here to accomplish? Across nearly 80 years of testimony, researchers and witnesses have proposed a range of answers to this question so wide that it stretches from the almost comforting to the genuinely disturbing. And examining that full range tells us as much about the fears and hopes of the humans doing the reporting as it does about any actual, coherent alien intention. The earliest and, in some respects, the most benign proposed explanation frames the visitors as scientific observers, engaged in a long-term, deliberate study of human civilization conducted with a self-imposed policy of minimal direct interference, a framework popularized in the broader culture by the fictional Prime Directive of the Star Trek franchise, but reflected independently in a genuine strand of ufological thought predating that show, in which repeated, low-key sightings without sustained contact are interpreted as evidence of a patient, anthropological approach, observing humanity's technological and social development from a careful distance rather than announcing an overt presence. This explanation has the advantage of accounting for one of the most persistent puzzles proponents of the phenomenon raise. If intelligent beings with vastly superior technology have been visiting Earth for the better part of a century, why have they not made unambiguous public large-scale contact? The observational hypothesis proposes that non-interference is itself the point, a deliberate choice rather than an oversight, though critics note this explanation is, by its very design, essentially unfalsifiable, since any absence of overt contact can always be reinterpreted as further evidence of the same deliberate restraint. A closely related but more urgent theme, present from the earliest days of the contactee movement and recurring with striking consistency across decades of testimony, frames the visitors as concerned custodians or elder guardians, motivated primarily by anxiety over humanity's capacity for self-destruction, expressed most consistently through concern about nuclear weapons. This theme is not confined to the contactees' claimed telepathic messages. It appears in one of the more institutionally credible and widely corroborated strands of testimony in the entire field, a documented pattern of reported UFO activity in close proximity to American nuclear missile installations. Most famously, the incident at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana on March 16, 1967, in which Air Force officer Robert Salas then serving as a missile launch officer, reported that a glowing disc-shaped object was observed hovering near a Minuteman missile launch facility shortly before 10 intercontinental ballistic missiles under his unit's control unexpectedly and simultaneously went into a guidance system fault status, becoming, in technical terms, unlaunchable, an event Salas and a number of fellow former Air Force personnel have testified to publicly and consistently in the decades since, including informal press conferences held in Washington, D.C., alongside other veterans of the missile forces describing broadly similar incidents at other installations. The Air Force has acknowledged that missile malfunctions of this general type did occur, but has attributed them to technical and electrical faults within the guidance systems themselves, rather than any external cause connected to the reported sightings, a conventional explanation Salas and his fellow witnesses reject as failing to account for the close timing and specific pattern they observed. And this category of nuclear site sightings remains one of the more frequently cited pieces of testimony among researchers who argue that the visitors' interest in Earth is specifically and pointedly tied to humanity's development of weapons capable of planetary-scale destruction. A darker and considerably more elaborate theory, building directly on the hybrid program narrative Bud Hopkins introduced in Intruders, proposes that the visitors' true agenda centers on a systematic, multi-generational genetic program involving the collection of human reproductive material and the deliberate creation of a hybrid human-alien lineage. This theory was extended well beyond Hopkins's original framing by researcher David Jacobs, a historian who took over much of the field's hypnosis-based case investigation through the 1990s and 2000s, and who, in his books Secret Life and the considerably more alarmist The Threat, argued that the hybridization program was not a benign or cooperative biological exchange, but a covert, coordinated, and ultimately hostile long-term project aimed at integrating hybrid beings into human society, potentially for purposes of eventual large-scale influence or control that human subjects, in Jacobs's account, were neither meaningfully consenting to nor able to resist. Jacobs's increasingly stark interpretation of the phenomenon drew serious criticism even from within the abduction research community, and his career became the subject of considerable public controversy in 2011 when a research subject he had worked with under the pseudonym Emma Woods publicly and in extensive detail accused him of conducting hypnosis sessions in ways she characterized as coercive and professionally inappropriate. Allegations Jacobs disputed, but that prompted broader, unresolved discussion within the field about the ethical standards, or lack of formal standards, governing lay hypnotic investigation of abduction claims, a controversy that echoes directly the same methodological concerns memory scientists had already raised about the field for decades. A related but distinct strand of agenda theory, considerably less prominent in serious testimony but persistent in more speculative corners of ufological literature, frames the visitor's interest in more transactional, almost colonial terms. As an advanced civilization interested in Earth's mineral resources, water, or unique biological and atmospheric conditions, a framework borrowed heavily from science fiction conventions of alien invasion and treated by most serious researchers, even those otherwise sympathetic to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, as one of the least evidentially supported explanations in the entire field, given how comparatively rarely resource extraction actually appears as a stated or implied theme in the primary testimony record compared to genetic, observational, or cautionary framings. Running alongside all of these theories and occupying a genuinely different category of claim is the ancient astronaut hypothesis, which proposes that the visitor's agenda is not a recent 20th century development at all, but a project stretching back into deep human prehistory involving direct alien intervention in the development of early human civilization, technology, and even religion. This idea entered mass popular culture primarily through Swiss author Erich von Däniken's 1968 book Chariots of the Gods, which argued that numerous ancient monuments and artifacts, including the Egyptian pyramids, the Nazca lines in Peru, and depictions in various ancient artworks, could not have been produced by the ancient civilizations conventionally credited with them, and must instead reflect either direct alien construction or technological assistance provided to ancient humans by extraterrestrial visitors later remembered and mythologized as gods. Von Daniken's book became an enormous international bestseller and remains, through its direct cultural descendant, the long-running History Channel series Ancient Aliens, one of the most widely consumed forms of UFO-adjacent media in the world. The ancient astronaut hypothesis has drawn unusually sharp and sustained criticism from professional archaeologists and historians, criticism that goes well beyond simple skepticism about extraordinary claims. Scholars in these fields have identified extensive, well-documented factual errors in von Daniken's specific claims about the construction methods, tools, and engineering knowledge actually available to ancient Egyptian, Peruvian, and other civilizations. Errors that archaeological and engineering research has repeatedly demonstrated are more than sufficient to explain the monuments in question using entirely conventional ancient technology and labor organization without requiring any extraterrestrial assistance. Beyond the specific factual disputes, a considerable number of archaeologists, historians, and indigenous scholars have raised a more pointed criticism of the ancient astronaut genre as a whole, arguing that its underlying assumption that non-European ancient civilizations must have required outside, non-human help to achieve monumental architecture and complex engineering that European observers found difficult to credit to those cultures' own ingenuity, reflects a long and troubling history of colonial-era condescension toward non-Western achievement, an argument taken seriously enough that it now features prominently in academic archaeology's formal response to the genre, even as the theory continues to enjoy enormous popular commercial success, entirely separate from its reception within the scholarly community that studies the actual monuments in question. The final major strand of agenda theory this documentary needs to address directly, because it represents one of the most widely circulated and most seriously disputed claims in the entire modern conspiracy landscape, is the reptilian hypothesis, most closely associated with British author and former sports broadcaster David Icke, who began developing and publishing the theory in the 1990s. Icke's claim, elaborated across numerous books beginning with 1999's The Biggest Secret, holds that a bloodline of shape-shifting reptilian extraterrestrial beings, which Icke associates with ancient Sumerian and Babylonian mythology and describes using the term Anunnaki, has secretly interbred with and infiltrated the highest levels of human political, financial, and royal power structures across the world, maintaining hidden control over global affairs across many centuries through a small number of elite bloodlines. Unlike the genetic hybridization theories developed by Hopkins and Jacobs, which describe an ongoing, largely covert biological program conducted on ordinary abductees, the reptilian hypothesis proposes something structurally different. A hidden ruling class, already fully integrated and in power, actively directing world events from behind a human disguise. This theory occupies a distinct and considerably more controversial position within the broader UFO research community than any other agenda theory this documentary has examined, and it is important to state the relevant criticism plainly and accurately. Journalists, scholars of conspiracy theory, and organizations that monitor anti-Semitism have extensively documented that the reptilian hypothesis, in its core narrative structure, a small, secret, non-human bloodline manipulating world governments, finance, and media from the shadows, closely mirrors the structure of considerably older anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, most notably the fabricated early 20th century text known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which similarly alleged a secret cabal covertly controlling world affairs. And researchers have documented specific instances in which reptilian conspiracy material has circulated within and been embraced by communities already promoting explicitly anti-Semitic content using the reptilian framing as a substitution or a coded proxy for the same underlying narrative. David Icke has repeatedly and publicly denied that his theory is intended as, or functions as, a coded reference to any specific ethnic or religious group, and has stated that his claim claims refer literally to non-human, extraterrestrial beings, rather than serving as a metaphor for any human population, a defense that has not satisfied his critics, who point to the specific historical sources Icke draws upon and the specific communities where his material has found its most receptive audience as evidence that the structural overlap is not coincidental. Whatever one concludes about Icke's personal intent, the reptilian hypothesis is treated with near-universal rejection by mainstream ufology researchers, including many who take the broader extraterrestrial hypothesis seriously on its own terms, both because it lacks any meaningful evidentiary basis beyond assertion and pattern matching to ancient mythology, and because of its documented entanglement with older and considerably more dangerous conspiratorial traditions. Standing back from this full range of agenda theories, from patient scientific observation to nuclear anxiety to genetic integration to ancient intervention to a hidden ruling bloodline, a pattern becomes difficult to ignore, and it is a pattern this documentary believes deserves to be stated honestly rather than left implicit. Each of these theories maps with remarkable precision onto a genuine, independently identifiable anxiety already present in the human societies that produced it. Cold War nuclear dread produced warnings about missile silos and self-destruction. Post-war anxiety about human reproduction, consent, and bodily autonomy produced the hybrid breeding program narrative. A skeptical, secular culture's discomfort with attributing ancient human achievement to ancient human ingenuity alone produced the ancient astronaut hypothesis. And a much older, darker tradition of conspiratorial thinking about hidden non-human elites controlling the visible world found, in the language of extraterrestrial biology, a new vocabulary in which to express itself. None of this proves that every agenda theory is purely a psychological projection with no underlying external reality whatsoever. But it does suggest, at minimum, that the question of what the visitors supposedly want has never been answered independently of the fears and preoccupations of the era, asking the question, a pattern worth holding on to as this documentary moves, in its next part, from the question of purpose into the deepest and strangest layer of the mythology, the claims of hidden underground facilities, secret space programs, and an alleged breakaway technological civilization operating entirely outside public knowledge or oversight. Dulce, disinformation, and the secret space program. Among the many strands of UFO mythology this documentary has examined, none is stranger and none more directly illustrates the genuine human cost this subject can carry than the story of an alleged underground base beneath the small town of Dulce, New Mexico, and the man whose personal unraveling did more than perhaps any single individual to build that story into a lasting piece of American folklore. That man's name was Paul Bennewitz, a physicist and successful electronics business owner living near Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, whose story begins not with a dramatic sighting, but with something considerably more mundane. In the late 1970s, Bennewitz became convinced, based on unusual radio signals and electromagnetic readings he was recording near his home, that he was intercepting communications between extraterrestrial beings and, disturbingly, elements of the United States government operating out of a joint underground facility beneath Dulce, roughly 200 miles to the north. Bennewitz brought his findings, along with a growing and increasingly elaborate theory involving mind control technology, cattle mutilations, and a covert alliance between government agencies and a hostile alien presence, to officials at Kirtland Air Force Base, whose Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the branch responsible for counterintelligence and security matters, took an interest in his case for reasons that had little to do with Bennewitz's actual theories and considerably more to do with genuine security concerns. Kirtland housed nuclear weapons storage facilities, and Bennewitz's monitoring equipment, whatever its actual accuracy, was picking up real electromagnetic signals in the vicinity of a highly sensitive military installation, and Air Force investigators needed to determine whether Bennewitz posed any kind of genuine security or intelligence risk, whether through inadvertent exposure of classified information or through deliberate targeting by a hostile foreign intelligence service using UFO cover as a pretext. What happened next has become one of the most thoroughly documented and most troubling episodes in the entire history of American UFO research, substantiated not merely by ufologists, but by subsequent journalistic investigation and by partial admissions from the individuals involved. Rather than simply determining that Benowitz posed no genuine security threat and closing the matter, an Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent named Richard Doty, according to extensive later reporting and Doty's own subsequent partial public acknowledgments, engaged in a sustained campaign of deliberate disinformation directed at Benowitz, feeding him fabricated documents, invented details about underground alien bases, and increasingly elaborate false confirmations of his existing theories, ostensibly intended to discredit Benowitz within the broader UFO research community and to distract him from any genuinely sensitive information he might have inadvertently gathered near the base, but with the practical effect of validating and dramatically escalating an already fragile man's paranoid belief system. Over the following several years, Benowitz's mental health deteriorated severely, ultimately resulting in a psychiatric hospitalization, while the disinformation Doty and his associates had fed him, including much of the specific mythology surrounding an underground joint human-alien facility at Dulce, complete with claims of biological experimentation and a supposed 1979 firefight between military personnel and hostile alien forces inside the base, continued to circulate and grow within the wider UFO research community for decades afterward, repeated and elaborated by subsequent researchers and authors who had no direct knowledge of the disinformation operation that had originated much of the specific material they were now presenting as credible insider testimony. The Benowitz affair carries a significance for this documentary that extends well beyond the specific, almost certainly fabricated details of the Dulce base mythology itself. It stands as one of the clearest documented cases in which genuine government counterintelligence activity, conducted for defensible, if ethically troubling reasons, related to protecting a sensitive military installation, actively generated and amplified a piece of UFO mythology that continues to circulate today as purportedly credible testimony, and it stands as a sobering illustration of how a vulnerable individual's declining mental health can become entangled with, and in this case was actively worsened by, both a compelling personal belief system and a cynical government disinformation effort that treated his well-being as entirely secondary to institutional security concerns. Richard Doty's subsequent career casts an even longer shadow over the broader mythology this documentary has already examined. Researchers investigating the origins of the Majestic 12 documents that surfaced in 1984, discussed in the previous part of this series, have long suspected, though never conclusively proven, that Doty or individuals connected to his disinformation activities may have played some role in that episode as well, given his documented history, his geographic and professional proximity to key figures in the UFO research community during the relevant period, and his own shifting, sometimes contradictory public statements about his activities over the following decades. Whatever the precise truth of Doty's full involvement across these episodes, his documented conduct in the Benowitz case alone establishes, beyond serious dispute, that at least some portion of the modern UFO cover-up mythology was not organically generated by genuine witness testimony, but was deliberately manufactured and seeded by government personnel for reasons entirely unrelated to any actual extraterrestrial presence. The Dulce base mythology has, in the decades since, become loosely and often confusingly associated with a separate and genuinely unresolved rural phenomenon. The wave of cattle mutilation reports that swept across the American West, beginning in the early 1970s and continuing intermittently for decades afterward, involving livestock found dead under circumstances ranchers and, in a number of documented instances, local law enforcement and even state investigators described as unusual, including precise, bloodless removal of specific organs and soft tissue, an absence of predator tracks or typical scavenger activity at the scene, and in some reported cases, unusual burn marks on the surrounding ground. Formal law enforcement task forces, including a New Mexico state investigation conducted in the late 1970s under Agent Gabe Valdez, examined a substantial number of these cases without reaching a definitive, universally accepted conclusion, and the phenomenon has since been attributed by different investigators to a range of causes, including natural predation and scavenging patterns misread by ranchers unfamiliar with the specific decomposition sequence livestock carcasses undergo, satanic cult activity theories popular during the same era's broader ritual abuse panic discussed earlier in this series, secret military or veterinary research testing, and, among UFO researchers, direct alien involvement, often folded into the broader Dulce base mythology as evidence of biological material being harvested to support activity at the alleged underground facility. No single explanation has been demonstrated to account for the entire body of reported cases, and the phenomenon remains, in the assessment of even cautious investigators, one of the genuinely stranger and more incompletely resolved rural mysteries of the era, whatever its ultimate relationship, if any, to the broader alien mythology it has become entangled with. The most recent, and, by the standards this documentary has otherwise tried to maintain throughout this series, the least well-corroborated layer of hidden mystery testimony emerged over the past 15 years, in the form of claims describing an entire alleged secret space program, a covert, technologically advanced human space presence, operating far beyond anything publicly acknowledged by NASA or any other national space agency, developed, according to these claims, using recovered and reverse-engineered alien technology in the decades following the Second World War. The most prominent proponent of these claims, a man named Corey Goode, came forward beginning around 2014, describing decades of alleged personal involvement in this secret program, including claimed travel to off-world bases and direct interaction with multiple distinct extraterrestrial civilizations. Testimony he presented extensively through the Gaia television and streaming network in collaboration with researcher and author David Wilcock. Goode's claims, considerably more elaborate and considerably less corroborated than any of the testimony examined earlier in this series, have drawn sustained criticism even from researchers otherwise sympathetic to the broader UFO phenomenon, including specific, documented accusations that portions of Goode's narrative closely paralleled plot elements from an obscure, self-published science fiction novel, allegations Goode has denied. A separate figure, the late William Tompkins, a former aerospace engineer, published a book in 2015 claiming decades of involvement in secret wartime and post-war programs involving contact with a benevolent, human-appearing extraterrestrial group he described as Nordic. Claims that, like Goode's, rest almost entirely on Tompkins's own uncorroborated personal testimony. These narratives have been organized and given a veneer of academic structure by researchers, including Michael Salla, who has developed and promoted an entire framework he terms exopolitics, intended to analyze the alleged political and diplomatic dimensions of humanity's ongoing, largely secret relationship with multiple extraterrestrial civilizations. This documentary treats the secret space program mythology with considerably more caution than the cases examined in earlier parts of this series, and it is worth stating plainly why. Unlike the Hill case, Pascagoula, or even the more disputed elements of Roswell, which involve identifiable witnesses giving testimony that was, at some point, subjected to independent scrutiny through polygraph examination, contemporaneous police investigation, or forensic document analysis, the secret space program claims of the 2010s rest almost entirely on the uncorroborated personal testimony of a small number of self-identified insiders, offered decades after the events they describe, distributed primarily through commercial media platforms with a direct financial interest in the content's popularity, and containing internal inconsistencies and unresolved credibility problems that have led even prominent, long-standing UFO researchers, individuals with no reflexive skepticism toward the broader phenomenon, to treat this specific body of claims as among the least credible in the entire field. Where this documentary has tried, throughout this series, to present genuinely contested cases with the full weight of evidence on both sides, the secret space program narrative represents, in the honest assessment of the broader research community itself, a considerably weaker category of claim, valuable to include in a full accounting of this mythology's hidden mystery mythology, precisely because of how widely it has spread through popular culture, but not comparable in evidentiary weight to the cases this documentary has treated as genuinely, unresolvedly mysterious. Taken together, the Dulce mythology and the secret space program claims that followed, it illustrates something important about how this entire subject has evolved over the 8 decades this documentary has traced. What began in the years immediately following the Second World War as spontaneous, often frightened testimony from ordinary witnesses describing something they could not explain has grown, generation by generation, into an increasingly elaborate, increasingly self-referential body of mythology in which later claims build directly on earlier ones. Official secrecy and deliberate disinformation actively shape what witnesses come to believe and report, and the line between investigating a genuine, unexplained phenomenon and simply extending an ever-growing work of collective, collaborative folklore becomes progressively harder to locate with each passing decade. Having traced this mythology from its folkloric roots through its darkest and least verifiable corners, this documentary now turns, in its next part, to a different kind of evolution entirely, the story of how the little green man and its many descendants colonized American and global popular culture, from the earliest pulp science fiction magazines through the golden age of Hollywood alien invasion films, and helped make this figure, whatever its ultimate reality, one of the most instantly recognizable images in the entire history of modern storytelling. From witness stand to cartoon, the alien in popular culture, everything this documentary has examined so far has moved along a track of witness testimony, government documents, investigative reporting, and scientific scrutiny, but running alongside that entire track, from the very earliest years of this mythology through to the present day, has been a second, equally powerful force shaping the public image of the alien visitor: commercial entertainment. And to understand why the little green man occupies the strange cultural position it does today, at once a subject some people regard as a matter of serious, unresolved scientific concern and a shape stamped onto children's lunchboxes and Halloween costumes, it is necessary to trace how thoroughly and how early popular fiction shaped the public's expectations before most real witnesses ever came forward. The template of the hostile alien invader predates the flying saucer era by half a century. H.G. Wells's 1898 novel, The War of the Worlds, established, in vivid and enduringly influential detail, the image of technologically superior Martians descending on Earth with hostile intent, and the novel's most famous adaptation, Orson Welles's October 1938 radio broadcast, presented in the format of simulated breaking news bulletins, has entered popular memory as having triggered a nationwide panic among listeners who believed an actual Martian invasion was underway. This popular account, however, has been substantially revised by media historians in recent decades, who have found that contemporary newspaper reports of mass panic were considerably overstated relative to the broadcast's actual, comparatively modest listenership and the limited localized nature of the panic that did occur, with subsequent research suggesting that newspapers, then engaged in a competitive circulation battle with the newer medium of radio, had a clear institutional incentive to exaggerate radio's capacity to mislead and endanger the public. The Wells broadcast nonetheless remains historically significant for a more modest but still important reason. It demonstrated, nearly a decade before Kenneth Arnold's sighting, how readily a mass audience could be primed to imagine hostile visitors from another world, laying essential cultural groundwork for the reception the flying saucer reports would receive when they began in earnest in 1947. The pulp science fiction magazines of the 1920s through 1940s, publications like Amazing Stories and Weird Tales, further developed and standardized the visual and narrative conventions that real witnesses would later draw upon, whether consciously or not, when describing their own encounters. Extraterrestrial beings frequently rendered as small, large-headed, and, in a meaningful number of illustrated covers and interior artwork, tinted green, an aesthetic choice loosely justified by the era's fascination with the supposed vegetation-based ecology of Mars, discussed earlier in this series in connection with Percival Lowell's mistaken canal observations. By the time real witnesses began reporting encounters in the post-war period, several decades of popular fiction had already thoroughly rehearsed, for a mass audience exactly what an alien visitor was supposed to look like, an important piece of context for understanding why witness descriptions across unrelated cases sometimes converge on broadly similar imagery, even when the underlying experiences, whatever their true cause, occurred independently of one another. The 1950s produced Hollywood's first sustained wave of alien visitor cinema, and film historians have long noted how directly these films functioned as vehicles for the decade's dominant anxieties. Robert Wise's 1951 film, The Day the Earth Stood Still, presented an alien visitor, Klaatu, who arrives not to conquer but to deliver an urgent warning about humanity's development of nuclear weapons and the threat this poses to the wider community of intelligent life, a narrative structure that closely echoes the warnings claimed by contactees of the same era and reflects the same genuine, pervasive nuclear anxiety that ran through the broader culture of the period. Don Siegel's 1956 film, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, by contrast, presented alien invasion not as a warning delivered by a benevolent visitor, but as a silent, undetectable replacement of ordinary townspeople by emotionless duplicates, a narrative widely read by film critics and historians, both at the time and since, as a reflection of Cold War anxiety about communist infiltration and the loss of individual identity to ideological conformity, though the film's original director and writers have both stated in later interviews that the story was intended more broadly as a commentary on conformity and the loss of individuality generally, rather than as a specifically anti-communist allegory, illustrating how readily audiences and critics can read a particular era's dominant political anxiety into a story that its own creators intended more ambiguously. Alongside these more thematically ambitious films, the decade produced a much larger volume of lower-budget science fiction features, monster pictures typically involving a single hostile creature, often achieved through a rubber suit and modest special effects that did less to shape the specific vocabulary of the UFO mythology. This documentary is tracing and considerably more to establish alien encounter as a broadly familiar, commercially reliable genre of mass entertainment in its own right. One of the most enduring and, in retrospect, one of the most telling contributions to the specific little green man image came not from a serious science fiction film at all, but from an animated comedy character, Marvin the Martian, created by Warner Bros. Animator Chuck Jones, and first appearing in the 1948 short Haredevil Hare, presented audiences with a small, green-skinned, helmeted Martian character, notable for his deadpan demeanor and his repeated, comically thwarted attempts to destroy Earth in order to improve his view of Venus. Marvin the Martian debuted just a year after Kenneth Arnold's sighting launched the flying saucer era, and decades before any of the major abduction or contact cases examined earlier in this series had entered public consciousness, and his character went on to become, through decades of continued television syndication, merchandising, and periodic revival, arguably the single most widely recognized visual embodiment of the specific phrase "little green man" in the entire history of American popular culture, a genuinely comic figure entirely disconnected from any actual witness testimony, and a clear illustration of how much of the modern popular image associated with this mythology was built by entertainment professionals working in comedy and merchandising rather than by anyone claiming a genuine encounter. The late 1970s and early 1980s produced a second major wave of cinematic reinterpretation that pulled the alien image in two sharply different directions simultaneously. Steven Spielberg's 1977 film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, discussed briefly in an earlier part of the series, presented contact with alien visitors in overwhelmingly benevolent, almost spiritually transcendent terms, drawing directly on the visual vocabulary of the gray alien that had emerged from the Hill case and would soon be even more famously depicted on the cover of Whitley Strieber's Communion, and doing more than any single film before or since to present alien contact as a source of wonder rather than fear. Spielberg followed this 5 years later with E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a film that pushed the softening of the alien image even further, presenting a small, large-eyed, vulnerable being as a sympathetic child's companion, a portrayal that, combined with the film's enormous commercial success and sustained merchandising presence, did as much as any single cultural artifact to fully domesticate the alien visitor for a mass audience, transforming a figure that had originated in genuine fear and unresolved testimony into a beloved, marketable character aimed specifically at children. Running in the opposite direction entirely, Ridley Scott's 1979 film, Alien, reintroduced a thoroughly hostile, monstrous, body horror version of the extraterrestrial encounter, drawing more directly on older science fiction invasion tropes than on any specific body of UFO witness testimony, and establishing an entirely separate, considerably darker cinematic tradition that would run in parallel to the more benevolent Spielberg-style Alien for decades afterward. Television made its own distinct and, in terms of shaping public belief in an active government cover-up, arguably more consequential contribution to the mythology beginning in 1993 with the premiere of The X-Files, a series that took the Majestic 12 mythology, the Roswell narrative, and the broader architecture of alleged government secrecy examined earlier in this series and wove them directly into a long-running, enormously popular dramatic narrative, complete with a shadowy antagonist widely understood by viewers to be modeled on real alleged disinformation figures within the intelligence community, and a central tagline, "The truth is out there," that became one of the most widely recognized catchphrases of 1990s American television. The X-Files is difficult to overstate in terms of its influence on how an entire generation of viewers came to understand and organize their beliefs about UFO secrecy, presenting week after week for 9 seasons, a fictionalized but carefully researched version of the exact conspiracy architecture, cover-ups, disinformation agents, and recovered alien technology that this documentary has spent several of its preceding parts examining as claimed, contested, and in some specific instances, demonstrably fabricated history and blurring for millions of casual viewers with no independent familiarity with the underlying case files, the line between the show's fictional embellishments and the actual, considerably messier historical record. By the final years of the 20th century and into the 21st, the alien visitor, in both its little green man and gray incarnations, had become one of the most commercially exploited images in global popular culture, appearing on everything from breakfast cereal boxes to the road signs of Nevada's Extraterrestrial Highway to the extensive tourist economy built around Roswell's annual UFO Festival and its International UFO Museum and Research Center. Perhaps no single moment better captures how completely the phrase had been absorbed into pure comic mascot territory, entirely divorced from any claim of serious testimony, than the 1995 release of Pixar's Toy Story, in which a set of small, green, three-eyed toy aliens are explicitly referred to within the film's own dialogue as the Little Green Men, presented as gentle, worshipful, entirely non-threatening characters existing purely for comic effect, a usage of the exact phrase this documentary is built around that would have been almost unrecognizable to the terrified family who fired shotguns at silvery, clawed figures on a Kentucky farmhouse roof 4 decades earlier. This is, in the end, one of the genuinely distinctive features of the Little Green Man mythology. Relative to almost any other paranormal or anomalous phenomenon this documentary could have chosen to examine, ghosts, cryptids, and psychic phenomena have all, to varying degrees, been absorbed into popular entertainment. But few, if any, have undergone a transformation as complete, as rapid, or as commercially thorough as the alien visitor, which now exists simultaneously in the same cultural moment as a subject taken seriously enough to warrant congressional hearings and Pentagon reporting mechanisms, which we will examine in the next part of this series, and as a cheerful, three-eyed plush toy sold at airport gift shops. Understanding that duality and understanding how thoroughly decades of film, television, and merchandising have shaped, reinforced, and in places actively contaminated the underlying testimony record this documentary has spent its previous parts examining is essential to any honest final assessment of what we actually know and do not know about this phenomenon. Conclusion: Little Green Men, Origins, Agenda, and Hidden Mysteries. The archetype of the Little Green Men, LGMs, is far more than a kitschy footnote in the annals of pop culture. It is a layered, resilient, and profoundly revealing mythos that has evolved across centuries, continents, and cognitive frameworks. To conclude any serious inquiry into their origins, purported agenda, and the enduring mysteries that cloak them is to confront not merely a speculative extraterrestrial hypothesis, but a mirror held up to humanity's deepest anxieties, hopes, and epistemological blind spots. The little green figure, standing scarcely 3 to 4 feet tall, with oversized cranium, almond-shaped eyes, and verdant skin, has become the default icon of the other. Yet beneath this cartoonish veneer lies a palimpsest of historical enigmas, psychological projections, and possibly a grain of unsettling truth that resists easy dismissal. The layered origins. From medieval fields to Kentucky skies, the genesis of the LGM cannot be pinned to a single moment or culture. Its roots twist back to the 12th century English village of Woolpit, where 2 green-skinned children allegedly emerged from a wolf pit, speaking an unknown tongue and refusing all food except raw beans. Chroniclers Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh recorded this anomaly with the sobriety of medieval historians, yet the event has never been convincingly explained, whether as a case of chlorosis, displaced Flemish immigrants, or a genuine encounter with an otherworldly realm. This anomalous episode planted the first seed of green humanoids in the Western imagination, long before the advent of science fiction. Centuries later, literary pioneers nurtured that seed. Washington Irving's 1809, A History of New York, whimsically depicted lunar inhabitants as pea green. The Atlanta Constitution of 1899 serialized the Green Boy from Harar, a Martian or interplanetary visitor, and Edgar Rice Burroughs's 1912, A Princess of Mars, introduced towering, 4-armed green Martians, cementing the color as shorthand for alien physiology. These fictional renderings, however, remained confined to pulp pages until the mid-20th century, when the UFO phenomenon exploded into public consciousness. The definitive watershed arrived on the night of August 21, 1955, in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. The Sutton family, along with several neighbors, reported a harrowing series of encounters with small, luminous, greenish-skinned creatures that descended from a metallic craft, moved with eerie agility, and appeared impervious to gunfire. The ensuing police investigation, media frenzy, and subsequent dismissal as mass hysteria or misidentified owls only deepened the mystique. Hopkinsville became the Rosetta Stone of LGM lore, transforming a literary motif into a lived, if contested, experience. It was this event that crystallized the modern template: diminutive stature, green complexion, large eyes, and a seemingly unearthly disregard for human weaponry. Yet, rather than resolving the origins, it multiplied them, inviting hypotheses ranging from interplanetary scouts to interdimensional tricksters, from time-traveling hominids to psychological manifestations of Cold War paranoia. The agenda: what do they really want? If the origins remain murky, the agenda of the little green men is even more elusive, fractured into a spectrum of speculative narratives. The most prevalent theory, popularized by contactees such as George Adamski, and later refined by abduction researchers like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, posits a long-term biological and genetic project. According to this view, LGMs, often conflated with gray aliens, though distinctions blur, are engaged in a covert, multi-generational program of human hybridization, harvesting genetic material, monitoring reproductive capabilities, and perhaps preparing for a future where their own species, depleted of vitality, requires human DNA for survival. This genetic rescue agenda paints a troubling picture. The little green men are not hostile invaders, but desperate genealogists, treating Earth as a laboratory and humanity as a resource. A second, more ominous interpretation casts them as custodians or wardens. Their frequent appearances near nuclear installations, missile silos, and test sites, as documented in numerous declassified military reports, suggest an acute interest in humanity's capacity for self-annihilation. In this narrative, the LGMs act as cosmic rangers, intervening subtly to avert catastrophic escalations, perhaps even disabling warheads, as alleged in the 1967 Malmstrom Air Force Base incident. Their agenda, then, is planetary stability, not for our sake, but for the preservation of a biosphere that may be of ecological or spiritual significance to a broader galactic community. Conversely, a more cynical school of thought dismisses any benevolent or scientific motive, framing the LGMs as manipulative deceivers. Drawing upon the demonological interpretations of authors like John Keel and Jacques Vallée, this perspective argues that the little green men are not extraterrestrial at all, but ultra-terrestrial entities, interdimensional phantoms that feed on human fear, belief, and chaos. Their agenda is not material, but psychological, to disrupt established worldviews, to catalyze religious and paranormal cults, and to keep humanity in a state of existential disarray. In this reading, the green skin is a costume, the saucer a stage prop, and the abductions a theater of the absurd designed to erode our collective grip on reality. A fourth, more prosaic explanation subsumes all agendas under the umbrella of misperception and social contagion. Here, the little green men have no agenda because they do not exist. They are waking dreams, sleep paralysis projections, or folkloric misreadings of mundane phenomena, owls, meteors, swamp gas. Their mysteries are artifacts of faulty memory and media amplification, and their origins are simply the byproducts of a culture saturated with science fiction imagery. Yet even this debunking stance cannot fully account for the consistency of the reports across time and geography, nor the physiological and psychological after-effects reported by abductees, which often include scars, implants, and post-traumatic stress that defy simple placebo explanation. Hidden mysteries, the veil of secrecy, and the unanswered questions. The most tantalizing dimension of the LGM phenomenon is the labyrinth of secrecy that surrounds it. Governments, most notably the United States, have declassified thousands of UFO documents, yet key files remain redacted or altogether missing. The infamous Project Blue Book, the Condon Report, and the recent Pentagon disclosures, AATIP, UAPTF, have acknowledged anomalous aerial phenomena, but have stopped short of confirming any extraterrestrial or green-skinned presence. This institutional opacity fuels a robust conspiracy ecosystem wherein the hidden mystery is not the aliens themselves, but the extent of official knowledge and the reasons for its suppression. Whistleblowers like Bob Lazar, though controversial, have alleged that crash-retrieved craft and even biological entities have been studied at sites like Area 51, with little green humanoids among the recovered specimens. The 1947 Roswell incident, long entangled with LGM lore, continues to spawn competing narratives: weather balloon, mogul project, or genuine extraterrestrial retrieval, with no definitive closure. Similarly, the 1980 Rendlesham Forest incident in the UK, often dubbed Britain's Roswell, involved military personnel encountering a craft and strange symbols. But again, official accounts remain evasive. These persistent gaps in the public record constitute the core of the hidden mystery. If the little green men are mere fantasy, why the persistent classification and denial? If they are real, what is being concealed, and who benefits from the concealment? Beyond governmental secrecy, deeper metaphysical mysteries remain unresolved. The LGMs appear to operate in a liminal space between the physical and the psychic. Abductees frequently report telepathic communication, out-of-body experiences, and a sense of timelessness during encounters, phenomena that elude conventional materialist frameworks. Some researchers, such as Vallée, propose that these entities exploit consciousness itself as a medium, rendering them detectable only under altered states. This suggests that the ultimate mystery may not be about little green men from Mars, but about the nature of reality, whether our universe is a layered construct where multiple intelligences coexist, and where the green-skinned visitor is merely one manifestation of a deeper, more ineffable order. The mirror and the door. In final analysis, the little green men are a paradox. They are at once the most trivial of pop cultural cliches, emblazoned on t-shirts, toys, and alien-themed restaurants, and the most potent symbol of humanity's confrontation with the unknown. Their origins are scattered across folklore, literature, and sensationalized newsprint. Their agenda is a Rorschach test for our collective fears and aspirations. And their hidden mysteries are as much about official secrecy as they are about the limits of human cognition. Perhaps the most profound conclusion we can draw is that the little green men are not extraterrestrials in the conventional sense, but exopsychological projections, emissaries from the dark corners of our own psyche, dressed in chlorophyll and starlight. They force us to ask uncomfortable questions. Are we alone? Are we observed? Are we cattle or co-creators? And if they are indeed visitors from elsewhere, their relentless silence about their true purpose may be the greatest mystery of all, a deliberate ambiguity that leaves us forever guessing, forever searching, and forever small beneath the vast, indifferent sky. Whether they are genetic engineers, cosmic guardians, interdimensional tricksters, or mass delusions, the little green men have achieved what no other alien archetype has. They have become the universal signifier of the unexplained, the permanent cipher of humanity's yearning for contact, and the perennial reminder that truth, when it finally arrives, may be greener and stranger than we ever imagined. The final mystery is not who they are, but why we need them to exist. And that question, unanswered, remains our own hidden secret, staring back at us from the depths of every starry night. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.